Welcome to the Quiet Chronicles. There is a story the ancient Greeks told for 1,000 years before anyone wrote it down. A war that lasted a decade. A man who took another decade just to get home. And a household that held itself together by the thinnest possible thread while it waited for him. The Odyssey is not simply an adventure. It is the account of what it costs a man to survive, what he loses, what he surrenders, what he becomes before he can become himself again. It is the account of a woman alone in a house full of men who want something from her, managing them for 20 years with nothing but intelligence and patience. It is the account of a boy who grows into someone capable of looking his father in the eye. If this is your first time on Quiet Chronicles, the channel publishes long-form history and mythology every week. And if the Odyssey moves you tonight, a like and a subscription mean you will be here for whatever comes next. Homer begins his poem in the middle, not at Troy, not at the beginning of the wanderings, but 10 years after the war ended, with Odysseus already gone 7 years on a goddess's island and his home already half consumed. The poem reaches backward and forward from that still point. So does this telling. Troy has already fallen. The fleet has already scattered. Odysseus is already at sea and already making his first mistake. Chapter 1: Leaving Troy. Troy burned for days. The city that had held out for 10 years did not fall cleanly. It fell the way exhausted things fall, in stages, with fires that started in one quarter and spread to another, while the Greeks moved through the streets doing what armies do after a long siege finally breaks. The great walls that Poseidon himself was said to have built still stood in places, while everything inside them was coming apart. The treasure was divided. The women were assigned. The men of Troy who had not died fighting died in the ways that follow fighting, and the smoke that rose from the lower city mixed with the smoke from the citadel and hung over the coast for a long time after the killing had finished. By the reckoning of those who kept such things, the Greek fleet that had assembled at Aeolus 10 years earlier had numbered more than 1,000 ships. What departed from the Trojan shore was considerably less than that. War takes its portion continuously, not only in battle. Plague had moved through the camp in the early years. Supply ships had been lost. Men had been invalided home, or had simply slipped away when the siege dragged into its 5th and 6th year, with no clear end in sight. The commanders who survived to make the return crossing were fewer than those who had arrived, and some of the ships that sailed were crewed by men who had watched better sailors die and found themselves holding oars they had not expected to hold. Agamemnon and Menelaus quarreled before the fleet left the Trojan coast. This was not unusual. The two brothers had been quarreling in various degrees of intensity for the entire 10 years, but this argument had consequences. Menelaus wanted to sail immediately. Agamemnon wanted to remain and offer sacrifices to Athena, whose anger at certain things done in Troy's last hours was already being whispered about in the camp. The argument split the fleet. Some captains went with Menelaus and departed at once into weather that proved treacherous. Others stayed with Agamemnon for the rights. Others, Odysseus among them, initially sailed with Menelaus and then turned back, perhaps for diplomatic reasons, perhaps because the omens on the water were not encouraging. The sources disagree, and Homer does not linger here. What is clear is that Odysseus set out from Troy with 12 ships. 12 ships carrying perhaps 600 men in total, which placed him comfortably in the middle rank of the expedition, not among the great lords who commanded 30 or 50 vessels, not among the minor captains who sailed alone. His men were Ithacans, islanders, practical sailors who knew the Aegeans' moods well enough to have survived 10 years of supplying a land campaign from a beachhead. They expected to be home in weeks. The winds from Troy to Ithaca were navigable in summer, and it was summer. The first landfall was not Ithaca. Ismarus lay to the north on the Thracian coast, and its people were the Cyclops, allies of Troy, which in the conventions of Bronze Age warfare made them legitimate targets for a commander sailing home from Troy's destruction. Odysseus attacked the city, took it without great difficulty, and divided the plunder among his men. He ordered them back to the ships immediately afterward. He said this clearly more than once. His men did not listen. There was cattle on the shore. There was wine in what had been the Cyclones' storerooms. The men had been on short rations for the last hard months of the siege, and the enemy city was already taken, and it was a warm evening, and the ships were not going anywhere without them. So they stayed. They lit fires on the beach and ate and drank through the night, and Odysseus, who understood what they could not yet see, waited with them and watched the darkness beyond the firelight, and understood that the night was already working against him. The Cyclones had allies inland, neighbors and kinsmen who kept horses, and who had not been inside Ismarus when Odysseus's men arrived. Word travels fast along a coast that knows its own geography, and by the time the sun came up over the Thracian hills, the reinforced Cyclone force was already forming on the shore above the beach, cavalry mixed with infantry, and the number was enough to make the situation immediately clear to every man who had been sitting by a fire an hour earlier, thinking the war was over. The fighting that morning on the beach at Ismarus was the first engagement of the journey home, and it went badly. Odysseus's men were not routed. They fought well enough to reach their ships and push off from the shore, but the price was 6 men from each vessel's rowing benches, killed on the sand or in the shallows. 72 men. The ships were not even out of sight of the Thracian coast when the counting was done. 72 men who had survived Troy and the siege, and 10 years of everything the war had required of them, dead on the first morning of the journey back, because the men they served with had wanted one more night on shore. Odysseus made the proper offerings. He called each man's name over the water 3 times, which was the custom, and the fleet put its oars to work and moved south. Zeus then sent a storm from the north, the kind that builds suddenly in late summer when cold air comes down from the mountains across the warm Aegean surface, and the fleet ran before it for 2 days and 2 nights. They could not make headway against it and did not try. They took down the sails and rowed where they could and held on where they could not, and when the storm finally relented on the 3rd day, they were far to the south of any course they had planned, in waters that were not quite familiar, approaching a coast that none of the Ithacans recognized with any confidence. This was the beginning. Not the storm, not even Ismarus, but the combination, the first error compounded by the first consequence, the lesson that might have been learned too late to be useful. What Odysseus could not yet know was that the storm Zeus sent was not weather. It was the opening move of something that would take 10 years to resolve. The gods had their own reckoning for what had happened at Troy, and it had not finished with the Greeks simply because the Greeks believed they were going home. The fleet limped south into unfamiliar water, 12 ships lighter than they should have been, carrying fewer men than they had left with, approaching a shore that none of them had ever seen. What waited there required nothing of them, except that they be tired enough to stop, and they were tired enough. Chapter 2: The Wanderer. Before the shore comes into view, before the lotus and the cave and the long list of everything the sea will take from him, it is worth pausing on the man himself, because what happens to Odysseus over the next 10 years is not random. It is shaped at every turn by what he is before any of it begins. He was the king of Ithaca, which was not a prestigious posting. Ithaca was a small island in the Ionian Sea, rocky and steep, better suited to goats than to grain, without the broad plains or the wealthy harbors that made a kingdom something other men envied. Agamemnon ruled Mycenae, which sat on a hill above a plain so fertile it seemed to generate gold. Menelaus had Sparta. Nestor had Pylos, old and stable and rich in horses. Odysseus had an island that its own inhabitants described, when they were being honest, as a hard place to love, and he loved it with a particularity that the poem returns to again and again, as if Homer understood that the intensity of Odysseus's desire to go home was inseparable from the smallness and difficulty of what he was going home to. A man trying to return to Mycenae would be trying to recover power. Odysseus was trying to recover a specific bed, a specific harbor, a specific view of the sea from a specific hillside. The scale of his desire was domestic, not imperial, and that made it harder to explain to anyone who had not felt it. Among the Greek commanders at Troy, he occupied a position that was easier to use than to honor. Achilles was the greatest warrior. Everyone acknowledged this, and everyone also acknowledged that Achilles was essentially ungovernable, which was the price of that greatness. Ajax was enormous and reliable and could be directed where needed like a siege engine. Diomedes was fast and ferocious and required watching. Odysseus was the man Agamemnon sent when the situation required something other than strength, when the problem was a negotiation that had gone wrong, or a demoralized army that needed to be talked back into its armor, or an enemy position that needed scouting without being seen. He had the kind of usefulness that does not generate songs, or did not generate the same kind of songs, and he was aware of this. What Achilles had in abundance: the burning, uncomplicated desire for glory, the willingness to die young rather than live long and be forgotten. Odysseus did not have and did not want. This is not a small difference between two heroes. It is the difference that makes the Odyssey a different kind of poem than the Iliad. The Iliad is about what it costs to be magnificent. The Odyssey is about what it costs to survive, and survival in Homer is not a simple or clean heroism. It requires compromises that the magnificent do not make. It requires the willingness to be nobody, to be small, to be overlooked, to let insults pass without answer when answering them would cost too much. Achilles, given the choice between a long, obscure life and a short, glorious death, chose the death without hesitation. Odysseus, given the same choice repeatedly over 10 years, chose the life every time, and the choosing was never easy and never without cost. He had left Ithaca at the beginning of the war with an infant son and a wife he had been married to for perhaps 2 years. Telemachus was too young to walk steadily when Odysseus departed. Penelope had known him barely long enough to understand who he was. The war took 10 years, and the wandering took 10 more, and by the time Odysseus finally stood again on Ithaca's shore, his son was a grown man he had never known, and his wife had spent the better part of her adult life managing a household in the expectation that he might never return. This arithmetic, 20 years, an infant become a man, a new marriage become a long and untested fidelity, runs underneath every episode in the poem, felt rather than stated, the clock that makes the urgency of the homecoming comprehensible. He sailed from Troy with 12 ships, which meant something close to 600 men under his command. It is worth holding this number for a moment. 600 men, sailors and soldiers, and the miscellaneous others a military expedition accumulates. Provisioners, craftsmen, men whose specific skills had been useful at Troy, and who had no better option than to sail home with the fleet that had brought them. 600 men who had survived 10 years of the war, and who now looked to Odysseus to get them back across the Aegean. By the time his story ends, he will arrive on Ithaca's shore alone, on a Phaeacian ship, while he sleeps. Every man who left Troy with him will be dead. This is not a spoiler. Homer states it in the poem's opening lines, before the story begins, as if to establish that what follows is not a story about whether Odysseus survives, but about what surviving costs and what it means. Poseidon hated him. This requires some explanation, because Poseidon's enmity is the engine that drives most of the wandering, and the enmity has a source that has not yet fully happened at the point where this chapter stands. It will happen in the next chapter, in a cave on an island full of monsters, when Odysseus does something that cannot be undone. But the hatred, once established, is comprehensive. Poseidon is the god of the sea and of earthquakes, the Earthshaker, one of the 3 brothers who divided the world among themselves when they overthrew their father. Zeus taking the sky, Hades the underworld, Poseidon the sea, and everything the sea touches. A man trying to cross water while Poseidon is actively opposed to his crossing is attempting something that the ancient world would have understood as structurally impossible. The sea does not simply become dangerous, it becomes intentional. Every storm has a mind behind it. Every favorable wind withheld is a decision. Athena loved him, and in the calculus of Olympian power, this was not nothing. She was the goddess of intelligence, of craft and strategy, of the kind of excellence that thinks before it acts, and sometimes instead of acting, and she recognized in Odysseus something she recognized in herself. The willingness to work obliquely, to approach a problem from the angle it does not expect, to value the solution over the glory of the solving. She could not counteract Poseidon directly. Zeus had not authorized her to, and the politics of Olympus required a certain deference to the sea god's jurisdiction over his own domain. What she could do was arrange. She could be present at moments when presence mattered. She could send a dream to a Phaeacian princess, ensuring she woke early enough to go to the river. She could appear as a family friend in Ithaca and say exactly the thing that a young man needed to hear. She is, across the poem, less a guardian than a director. She does not rescue Odysseus so much as she ensures the conditions exist for him to rescue himself, which is the kind of help she judged he both needed and deserved. Between these two forces, Poseidon's sustained enmity below him and Athena's careful favor above, Odysseus navigated 10 years of open water. The wandering is not a sequence of bad luck. It is a theological argument conducted through geography, and Odysseus is both its subject and its most active participant. There is a moment the poem offers before any of the wanderings are narrated in full. Homer places it early, as if to give the reader a fixed point around which everything else will eventually organize. Odysseus is on the island of Ogygia, where Calypso the goddess has kept him for 7 years. He is sitting on the shore. Every day he walks down to the water and sits and looks toward the horizon, toward the direction where Ithaca would be if he could cross the sea that lies between them, and weeps. Not from despair exactly, but from the specific grief of a man who can see clearly what he wants and cannot reach it. Calypso's island was beautiful in ways the poem catalogues carefully. The alders and poplars and fragrant cypresses, the grapevines heavy in season, the 4 springs running clear in 4 directions. It was not a hardship. It was a paradise from which he could not leave, and every evening he returned to Calypso's bed because there was nothing else to do, and every morning he returned to the shore to sit and look and grieve. This image, a man on a shore weeping toward a horizon, is the emotional center of the Odyssey, placed early so that everything that follows can be understood against it. All the monsters and the divine interventions and the clever solutions and the long patience of Ithaca waiting, they are all in service of getting that man off that shore and back across the water to the island he cannot stop wanting. The fleet does not know any of this yet. It is still 12 ships strong, or nearly, and the men at the oars are tired but not yet despairing, and the unfamiliar coast is just coming into view ahead, and whatever it holds has not yet held anything for them. The shore was quiet. That was the first thing they noticed. No smoke of settlement, no sound of animals, no sign of the ordinary noise a populated coast makes. Just a long, low beach, and beyond it a meadow, and beyond the meadow nothing alarming. No walls, no watchfires, no armed men forming up. They landed without difficulty. What came next required nothing more from the island than that it simply be what it was. Chapter 3: What the Lotus Does. The land had no name that any of Odysseus's men knew. It lay somewhere to the south of the course they had planned, pushed there by Zeus's storm off the Thracian coast, and its precise location in the geography of the ancient Mediterranean has never been settled to anyone's satisfaction. Later writers placed it along the North African shore, Libya perhaps, or the coast near what is now Tunisia, and there were Greeks in the classical period who believed the lotus plant of the story was a real fruit native to that region, sweet and narcotic, eaten by people who lived along certain stretches of the African coastline, and who were described by later geographers as gentle and indifferent to the wider world. Whether that identification is correct matters less than what Homer says the plant does, because what Homer says it does is not quite what any drug does. It does not sedate. It does not cause visions. It causes forgetting, specifically the forgetting of home. Odysseus sent 3 men ahead to investigate. This was standard practice, the same kind of careful reconnaissance he had used in every unfamiliar situation since Troy, and there was nothing in the look of the shore that morning to suggest it required more caution than usual. 3 men sent to find out what kind of people lived here and whether the fleet could expect to take on water and supplies without trouble. The men walked inland and found the Lotus Eaters, and the Lotus Eaters were not hostile. This is the detail Homer emphasizes, and it deserves emphasis because hostility would have been easier to manage. A people who attack you can be fought or fled. A people who simply offer you food from genuine hospitality and ask nothing in return are harder to resist, and the food they offered was the lotus, and the 3 men ate it. What happened next is described in the poem with a quietness that is almost clinical. The men who ate the lotus no longer wished to bring back a report. They no longer wished to return to the ships. They sat among the Lotus Eaters and wept, not from pain, not from fear, but from the surfacing of a grief they could not quite name, which was the grief of people who have just lost something they did not know they were still holding. Home, the idea of home. The specific wanting that had been pulling them westward across the Aegean for weeks since they left Troy, it simply ceased. It did not die violently. It dissolved, the way a strong intention dissolves when the body becomes warm enough and comfortable enough, and the mind stops supplying the energy that intention requires. Odysseus went after them himself. He did not send others. He understood that this was a situation that required his specific authority and perhaps his specific capacity for being unmoved by things that moved everyone around him. He found the 3 men on the shore among the Lotus Eaters, and he assessed the situation in the way he assessed most situations, quickly, practically, with the part of his mind that was always calculating the cost of every available option, and he took hold of them and dragged them back to the ships by force. They wept the whole way. They did not fight him. The lotus had not made them violent or even resistant in any physical sense. They simply grieved and kept grieving and had to be lifted into the ships and bound under the rowing benches, because if they were left unrestrained, they would have walked back to the shore. The binding is the detail that stays. Odysseus had the men tied beneath the benches, not cruelly, not as punishment, but as the only practical solution to the problem of men who could no longer be trusted to choose correctly. He then ordered the rest of his crews back to the oars immediately, before anyone else could step onto that shore and be offered what the 3 scouts had been offered. The fleet pushed off and rowed hard until the coast was behind them, and the men under the benches had either recovered enough to be untied or had simply exhausted themselves with weeping and gone quiet. Whether they fully recovered is a question the poem does not answer. Homer moves on, as he generally does, without dwelling on the aftermath of the episodes he has just described. The 3 men who ate the lotus sail on with the fleet for the rest of the journey, unnamed, part of the collective body of the crew, and we do not know whether the wanting eventually returned to them, or whether they spent the remainder of the voyage rowing in the direction of a home they could remember but no longer desire. This is the thing the episode quietly insists upon, and it is worth a moment's consideration. The Lotus Eaters represent nothing sinister by the standards of the heroic world. They did not steal from Odysseus's men. They did not threaten them. They offered hospitality in the only form they had available, which happened to be the thing most dangerous to men on a journey. The danger was entirely inside the men who accepted it, in the exhaustion that made the forgetting attractive, in the grief of 10 years at war that had been held in suspension by the necessity of getting home, and that the Lotus released into something that felt, in the moment, like peace. Every subsequent disaster in the Odyssey involves some version of this same interior failure. The crew that opens the bag of winds will do it because they cannot trust what they cannot see. The crew that eats the cattle of Helios will do it because they cannot hold out against hunger and despair long enough for the winds to change. The men who become pigs on Circe's island will do it because they walked into a beautiful house and accepted a drink from a woman who seemed welcoming. The pattern is not stupidity. It is the particular vulnerability of men who have been at the edge of endurance for so long that the part of them which resists dangerous comfort has worn thin. Odysseus resisted every time. This is what makes him singular in the poem, and it is also what makes him, in certain lights, lonely. The only man in his fleet who could not afford to stop wanting home for even an afternoon. The only man who had to stay sharp enough to drag the others back from every shore that offered them release. He dragged them back this time, and the fleet rowed south, and the coast of the Lotus Eaters fell behind them and ceased to be visible, and the men under the benches were quiet now, spent, and the sea ahead was empty of everything except the next thing. The next thing was an island across a narrow strait, and on the island, high in the hills above the shoreline, there were lights, firelight, moving slowly in the dark, and a sound that carried across the water, deep and irregular, that took some time to identify. It was laughter. Chapter 4: The Cave of the One-Eyed. The island across the strait was uninhabited, or nearly, a small island thick with wild goats and timber, with a natural harbor deep enough to shelter the fleet without anchors, and no people. The Cyclops lived on the larger landmass visible beyond it, up in the hills, and from the smaller island Odysseus's men could see their fires at night and hear, when the wind was right, the sound of their voices. They spent a day hunting the wild goats and eating well, which was the first proper meal since Ismarus, and Odysseus looked across the water at the larger island and felt the thing he almost always felt when confronted with an unknown shore, the need to know what was there. He took one ship, 12 men chosen from his own vessel's crew. The others he left on the small island with instructions that were clear enough: stay, eat, wait. The single ship crossed the strait in the early morning and beached below a cave set high in the cliffs, ringed with laurel, with pens of sheep and goats built from rough stone along its outer wall. The cave itself was enormous, tall enough to stand in without difficulty, wide enough to hold the pens of young animals inside it, alongside great wheels of cheese and pails of whey and racks for storing milk. Someone lived here who organized their pastoral life with considerable care. Someone was not home. Odysseus's men looked around the cave and made the obvious suggestion: take the cheese, drive off the lambs and kids, get back to the ship. It was practical advice. It was the advice of men who had learned something at Ismarus about the cost of lingering in places where they were not wanted. Odysseus did not take it. He wanted to see the owner of this cave, he said, and to test whether the owner would offer the guest gifts that hospitality required. Whether he genuinely believed this, or whether he was already calculating something more complex, is a question the poem allows but does not answer. What is clear is that he stayed, and his men stayed with him, and they lit a fire and helped themselves to the cheese and sat down inside the cave to wait. The Cyclops came home at evening, driving his flocks before him. He was large in the way that makes the word large insufficient, a single peak of flesh and bone that had to turn sideways to fit the flock through the cave mouth, carrying a load of timber for his fire that would have taken 4 normal men to lift. He was the son of Poseidon, though Odysseus did not know this yet, and his name was Polyphemus, and he had one eye set in the center of his forehead, which caught the firelight when he turned and gave it back redoubled. He sealed the cave mouth with a boulder that 20 ox carts could not have shifted. He milked his ewes with practiced efficiency in the dark. He lit his fire, and the light reached the back of the cave where Odysseus and his men were standing very still, and he saw them. His response to finding strangers in his cave was not the response the laws of hospitality prescribed. He asked who they were and where their ship was, and Odysseus gave him the name of no one and said the ship was gone, wrecked by Poseidon on the rocks, a lie constructed quickly and for obvious reasons, though the invocation of Poseidon's name in that cave before that particular Cyclops was an irony Odysseus could not yet appreciate. Polyphemus's response to this was to reach into the group of men and take 2 of them and eat them. He then went to sleep. Odysseus drew his sword in the dark and considered killing the Cyclops where he lay, and stopped himself because the boulder at the cave mouth could not be moved by any number of human men, and killing the only creature capable of moving it would seal them inside the cave permanently. He sheathed the sword and thought instead, which is, in this poem, always the more dangerous act. The olive wood log was already in the cave. Polyphemus had cut it for a walking staff, a length of seasoned olive wood the size of a ship's mast, lying against the cave wall to dry. Odysseus cut a section from it during the day while the Cyclops was out with his flocks, sharpened one end to a point, hardened the point in the fire's embers, and hid it under the dung that lay in deep drifts along the cave walls. That evening, when Polyphemus returned and ate 2 more men and settled near his fire, Odysseus approached him with a bowl of wine. The wine was from Ismarus, the gift of Maron, priest of Apollo, given in gratitude for Odysseus's protection of his family during the sack. It was extraordinary wine, the kind meant to be mixed 20 parts water to 1, and Odysseus was offering it undiluted in a great bowl to a creature who had never tasted anything fermented in his life. Polyphemus drank it and asked for more, and asked the stranger's name, and Odysseus told him, "Nobody. My name is Nobody, and that is what my mother and father call me and all my companions." Polyphemus, warm with wine now and pleased with himself, told nobody his gift in return for the wine would be that he would eat nobody last. He fell asleep. What followed was the work of 4 men and a sharpened stake and a fire built up to the right temperature and a single coordinated movement in the dark. The stake went into the embers until the point glowed. Then it went into the Cyclops' eye. Polyphemus' scream brought the other Cyclopes to the cave mouth. They gathered outside and called to him, asking what was wrong, who was hurting him, and he screamed back that nobody was killing him, nobody was destroying him by trickery, and the Cyclopes outside concluded their neighbor was ill, perhaps divinely afflicted, and went back to their own caves. The logic of the name had worked exactly as Odysseus had designed it to work. The boulder was removed at dawn to let the flocks out, and Polyphemus knelt at the cave mouth and ran his hands along the backs of the sheep as they passed, checking for men riding on top. Odysseus had planned for this as well. He had tied his men each beneath the belly of a ram, gripping the wool from underneath, hidden from the hands moving over the fleeces. Odysseus himself went last, clinging to the underside of the largest ram in the flock, the animal Polyphemus loved best, which had always led the others out. The ram paused at the cave mouth longer than the rest, and the blind Cyclops spoke to it softly, wondering why it was last today, wondering whether it sensed its master's pain. Then the ram walked out into the morning, and Odysseus with it, and they ran for the ship. The men were already rowing hard when Odysseus stood at the stern and shouted back at the cave in the cliff above the shore. His men begged him not to. They had argued this on the ship already, pulling for the open sea as fast as they could move, and they understood perfectly well that what Odysseus was feeling was the need to be known, to have credit for what he had done, to be seen as the man responsible rather than as nobody who had done nothing. The arguments were good. The arguments were correct. Odysseus shouted anyway. He shouted that the man who had blinded Polyphemus was Odysseus of Ithaca, son of Laertes, and let his name be known. Polyphemus had prayed to Poseidon even before he heard the name, had torn the peak off the cliff above the cave and hurled it toward the sound of the oars, nearly swamping the ship with the wave it raised. But now he had the name. He called to his father Poseidon with the full name given. If it is truly fated that this man Odysseus, son of Laertes, of Ithaca, must reach home, then let him come late, alone, on a stranger's ship, and let him find grief when he arrives. Poseidon heard. Poseidon, who was always listening when his son called. Odysseus had solved the problem of the cave with intelligence and patience, and a willingness to become nobody in order to survive. Then he had undone the solution with the one quality he could not entirely govern, the need to be Odysseus after having been nobody for too long. It is not a simple failure. It is the most human failure in the poem, and Homer renders it without condemnation because he understood that the quality that made Odysseus shout his name across the water was inseparable from the quality that had kept him thinking when every other man in that cave had given up. You could not have the one without risking the other. The ships pulled away into open water, the cave receding behind them, the Cyclops at the cliff's edge listening for the sound of oars, still calling his curse out to his father in the sea. The other ships were waiting across the strait. The men there had heard the screaming and then the silence, and they had stood on the shore watching the single vessel come back across the water with less than it had left with. Nobody asked immediately how many had been lost. Some things are understood before they are spoken. Odysseus divided the Cyclops' sheep among all the crews and ordered the sacrifice of the great ram, the one that had carried him out of the cave, to Zeus. Whether Zeus accepted the sacrifice with any warmth, the smoke and the signs did not make clear. They ate and they mourned, and when the sun went down, they lay on the shore beside the sea and slept. In the morning there was the wind that winds provide indifferently, and the oars, and the flat line of the horizon ahead, and somewhere beyond it the next island, which none of them had seen yet, but which was already there, waiting with the patience that places have when they are waiting for specific people. Chapter 5. Naming the Storms. Aeolia floated. This is what Homer says, and it is worth taking seriously rather than explaining away. A floating island, held in place by no geography, ringed by a wall of unbreakable bronze, its cliffs rising sheer from the water on all sides. The Greeks had a category for places like this, the edges of the known world, where the rules that governed ordinary coastlines did not quite apply, where the mortal and the divine ran together in ways that made navigation unreliable in more than the practical sense. Aeolia was one of these places, and its king was Aeolus Hippotades, a man the gods had trusted with something they trusted to very few mortals, the keeping of the winds. He was not a god himself. Homer is careful about this distinction in a poem full of gods, because the distinction matters. He was a man who had been given a divine responsibility, which is a different and in some ways more interesting condition, the condition of someone who stands at the intersection of the mortal and the immortal without fully belonging to either. He lived on his floating island with his 6 sons and 6 daughters, all 12 of them married to each other in the closed and self-sufficient way of a family that had decided the world beyond its walls had nothing it needed. They feasted every day. The house was always full of the smell of meat and wine and the sound of people who had never been required to want for anything. Aeolus received Odysseus with genuine hospitality. This, after the Lotus eaters and the Cyclops, had the quality of something almost painful in its contrast. A host who asked about Troy, who listened with real attention to the account of the war and the wandering, who wanted to know everything and gave his guests a month to tell it. A month on Aeolia, with proper beds and proper food, and an audience who found the story of Odysseus's life genuinely worth hearing. It is easy to forget, moving through the disasters of the Odyssey, what Odysseus is actually like when given the opportunity to be himself in a room full of interested listeners. He was extraordinary at it. The version of himself he deployed at Aeolus's table, the storyteller, the commander reflecting on his campaign, the man with the kind of history that fills a room, was not a performance. It was the self that the wandering kept requiring him to suppress. When the month ended and the fleet prepared to leave, Aeolus made his gift. He took the winds of the world, all the contrary and storm-bearing winds, everything that blows against a westward course from Troy to Ithaca, and sealed them into a bag made from the hide of a 9-year ox, closing it with a silver cord, and gave it to Odysseus to keep aboard his ship. What remained free was the west wind, Zephyr, which would carry them home. The gift was comprehensive, and it was generous, and it came with no condition except that the bag not be opened. Aeolus did not explain what was inside it, and Odysseus did not tell his men. This was the mistake, though it did not feel like one at the time. It felt like prudence. The information was dangerous, the bag was dangerous, and the fewer people who knew what it contained, the fewer opportunities for disaster. Odysseus had been making calculations of this kind for 10 years at Troy, and they had generally served him well. He stowed the bag in the hollow of the ship, under his own bench, lashed it down himself, and kept the watch himself for 9 days as the fleet ran before Zephyr toward Ithaca. 9 days. The winds were fair, and the course was true, and the ships moved well, and on the 10th day the coast of Ithaca came into sight, close enough to see clearly, close enough to make out the fires burning on the shore in the evening, close enough that men were pointing and gripping each other's arms, and doing the wordless things people do when something they have wanted for a very long time is suddenly visible and real. Close enough that Odysseus, who had not slept in 9 days, who had been sitting at the tiller for 9 consecutive days refusing to surrender it to anyone, finally allowed his eyes to close. He was asleep when his crew acted. They had been watching him guard the bag for 9 days. They had drawn their conclusions, reasonable conclusions, from where they stood with the information they had. The bag was heavy, and it clinked softly when the ship moved, and their commander had not let it out of his sight for 9 days, and had not explained why, and the most plausible explanation available to men who had been promised nothing and given little was that the bag held gold and silver, a private gift from the king of the winds that Odysseus intended to keep for himself while they received their equal shares of nothing. The grievance was understandable. The decision it produced was catastrophic. They opened the bag. The winds came out all at once. Every storm and adverse gale that Aeolus had sealed away released together in the space between Ithaca's coast and the open sea. The ships were seized and spun and driven eastward faster than they had come, the coast vanishing behind them, the fires on Ithaca's shore disappearing into the distance as the fleet was pushed back across all 9 days of sailing in what felt like hours. Odysseus woke to the sound of his ships in distress and understood immediately and completely what had happened, and sat for a moment with that understanding before he could make himself move. He considered briefly going into the sea. The poem says this plainly. He thought about whether to go overboard and drown, and decided against it, and pulled his cloak over his face and lay in the ship while it was carried back across the Aegean. This is one of the moments in the Odyssey where Homer lets the reader see the full weight of what his hero is carrying, not the cleverness or the endurance or the capacity for survival, but the simple human fact of a man who has just watched 10 years of war and weeks of wandering come to nothing in the time it took his exhausted body to fall asleep. Ithaca had been visible. The fires on the shore had been visible. They returned to Aeolia. There was nothing else to do. Odysseus went ashore alone and found Aeolus and told him what had happened and asked for help, for the winds again, for another chance at the crossing. Aeolus looked at him for a long time and then said no. He said it without cruelty but without apology. He said that a man the gods hated this specifically was a man he would not work against the gods to help, and that Odysseus should leave his island. The floating island with its bronze walls and its feasting family and its month of genuine hospitality closed itself to Odysseus as completely as the Cyclops' cave had closed, and for the same essential reason, Polyphemus had called on Poseidon, and Poseidon had answered, and the answer was visible now in everything that happened when Odysseus came close to going home. The fleet left Aeolia and rowed. Without the gift of winds, there was nothing to do but row, and they rowed for 6 days through flat, unhelpful weather before the coast of the Laestrygonians came into sight. The harbor looked perfect. That was the problem. It looked exactly like the kind of harbor a fleet of exhausted ships needed, enclosed on 3 sides by high cliffs, the water inside it calm and deep, the entrance narrow but navigable. 11 of Odysseus's 12 captains steered their ships inside. Odysseus, on some instinct he could not have named at the time, caution perhaps, or the particular weariness of a man who had recently been reminded what safe-looking places can conceal, moored his own ship outside the harbor mouth at the end of a rope tied to a rock on the cliff. The Laestrygonians appeared at the cliff tops almost immediately. They were enormous in the way the Cyclops had been enormous, but where the Cyclops had been pastoral and solitary, the Laestrygonians were organized. They threw rocks from the cliffs above the harbor. Boulders dropped from height into the enclosed water, which in a harbor with no room to maneuver was not a battle but an ending. The rocks stove in the hulls of the ships below. Men who were not crushed immediately were speared in the water like fish, the Laestrygonians lining the cliff edges and working with the efficient enthusiasm of people who had found something they were good at. 11 ships were destroyed. Every man aboard them was killed or taken and eaten. Odysseus cut the rope with his sword, screamed at his own crew to row, and the one remaining ship pulled out of the harbor entrance and into open water, while behind it the harbor was still full of the sound of what was happening to the men who had gone inside. They rowed in silence for a long time after the coast fell behind them. One ship, perhaps 40 or 50 men, from a fleet that had left Troy with 600. The accounting, if anyone was doing it, was becoming very difficult to look at directly. The coast that eventually appeared ahead was forested and quiet, with a thread of smoke rising from somewhere in the interior, a single thin line of it, the kind of smoke a hearth makes when someone inside is cooking or weaving or simply keeping a fire against the cold of an autumn evening. The island was called Aea. None of them knew this yet. They beached the ship and lay on the shore for 2 days without moving, too diminished by everything that had accumulated to do anything except lie there and let time pass over them. On the 3rd morning, Odysseus climbed to high ground and looked at what surrounded them, and the smoke was still rising from the forest, patient and thin and giving nothing away. Chapter 6. Aea. The smoke meant someone lived here, and someone living here meant the choice Odysseus had been making since Ismarus: investigate or avoid, go toward the unknown or row past it, presented itself again in the same essential form. He stood on the high ground and looked at the thread of smoke rising from the forest, and understood that his men were in no condition to make this decision rationally. They were frightened in the way that accumulates rather than spikes. the long, slow fear of men who have watched the numbers around them diminish steadily and who have begun to feel the diminishment as a law rather than a run of bad luck. When he came back down and told them what he had seen, some of them wept, not from the news itself, but because the news meant they were not done yet, and they had been hoping in the wordless way exhausted people hope that they might somehow already be done. He divided them by lot into 2 groups of 22 men. He would lead one party himself. Eurylochus would lead the other. Whichever group the lot chose would go toward the smoke. The other would remain with the ship. The lot fell to Eurylochus, and his men armed themselves and walked into the forest, and Odysseus and the rest stayed on the beach and waited. The house stood in a clearing, built of dressed stone, solidly made, the kind of structure that suggested permanence and planning rather than the rough shelters of someone living at the edge of survival. Around it, in the sunlight of the clearing, lay wolves and lions, not chained, not penned, simply lying in the grass the way dogs lie outside a house when the weather is good. They rose when Eurylochus's party came out of the trees and approached, but they did not threaten. They wagged their tails and reared up and pressed their great heads against the men's hands in the manner of animals that have been tamed past their nature into something that resembles welcome. The men found this more unnerving than aggression would have been. Something had been done to these animals. Something had changed them from what they were into an imitation of what they were not, and the imitation was careful enough to be almost convincing. From inside the house came the sound of singing and a loom working, the 2 sounds woven together, the regular rhythm of the shuttle and the voice moving above it in something that was not quite a song and not quite speech, but occupied the territory between them. The men stood outside and called, and the door opened, and a woman appeared and invited them in. Eurylochus did not go in. He stood outside the door while his 21 companions filed into the house, and something he could not name, an instinct refined perhaps by watching everything that had happened since Troy, by standing on a shore while a harbor full of ships was destroyed, by the accumulated education of the journey, kept his feet where they were. He watched his companions go inside. The door closed. The singing resumed. After a while, the sounds from inside the house changed in a way he would later struggle to describe accurately, and then there was silence, and then through a high window he could see something moving that was not quite the shape of men, and he ran. He came back to the beach alone. He was so frightened that for some time he could not speak clearly enough to be understood, kneeling on the sand, weeping, managing only fragments of what he had seen before the full account came out. Circe. The name came later, when Odysseus returned from the house, and Circe told him herself. What Eurylochus conveyed was the essential fact. 21 men had gone into the house, and what was in the house now was not 21 men. Odysseus took his sword and his bronze-tipped spear and walked into the forest alone. Eurylochus had refused to go back. Odysseus had not argued with him, because Eurylochus refusing to go back to that house was the correct decision, and both of them knew it. He walked alone through the forest toward the clearing, and in the oak wood before the clearing he met a young man. The young man was perhaps 16 or 17, his first beard just beginning, carrying a golden staff, and he moved through the trees with the particular quality of ease that distinguishes the divine from the mortal in Homer. Not supernatural exactly, but frictionless, as if the undergrowth simply stepped aside. He told Odysseus he knew where he was going and why, and he told him about the house and about what had happened inside it, and then he told him about the moly. The moly was a plant, black-rooted and white-flowered, difficult for mortals to find and harder to pull from the earth. But this young man pulled it without effort and gave it to Odysseus and told him how to use it, to eat the root before he drank anything Circe offered, which would make him immune to her transformation. And then, when she struck him with her wand and nothing happened, to draw his sword and rush at her as if he intended to kill her. He would not need to kill her. The sword would be enough. She would be frightened, and when she was frightened, she would offer terms, and he should accept the terms, but only after making her swear the oath of the gods that she intended no further harm. The young man was Hermes. He disappeared back into the trees the way he had come, and Odysseus went on to the clearing. What followed in the house proceeded almost exactly as Hermes had described it. Circe mixed her drink in a golden cup and stirred into it the drugs that she stirred into everything she gave to men who came to her door, drugs that made them forget their home and their nature and whatever they had been before they walked into her clearing. She gave it to Odysseus and watched him drink it, and then struck him with her wand and told him to go to the sty with the rest of her pigs. Nothing happened. Odysseus drew his sword. The speed and certainty of the movement, no hesitation, no attempt at negotiation, the blade coming out in the single motion Hermes had described, startled her badly. She fell to her knees and reached for his legs and asked who he was, because no man had ever resisted her drink, and there was a prophecy, she said, that a man called Odysseus from Ithaca would come to her island on his way home from Troy and would be immune to what she could do. She had been waiting, she said, and she had not expected to be afraid of him when he came. He made her swear the oath, and she swore it, and his men were restored, the transformation reversed. Each of them returned to himself, but younger than he had been before, and better looking, and shaken in the way of people who have just returned from somewhere they cannot entirely describe. They came out of the sty into the afternoon light and wept when they saw Odysseus, and he wept with them, and Circe watched this and seemed to find it instructive. She was, once the contest between them was resolved, a different kind of host than any Odysseus had encountered, not simply hospitable, actively useful. She fed his men and bathed them and clothed them and let them rest, and she understood what the journey had taken from them in ways that suggested she had been watching it from Aea long before they arrived. The fleet was summoned from the beach. The men who had stayed behind came into the house and found their companions restored, and the reunion had the slightly disorienting quality of reunions between people who have had very different experiences in the same period of time. They stayed for a year. A year on Aea, eating Circe's food and drinking her wine and sleeping in her beds and slowly becoming, chapter by chapter of ordinary life, something close to what they had been before Troy. It was Eurylochus who finally said what the men had been thinking, that they had been here long enough, that it was time to talk about going home, that a year was a year and Ithaca was still where it had always been. He said it in front of Circe, which was either brave or tactless, and Circe did not appear offended. She looked at Odysseus and told him his men were right. It was time. But before he could sail for home, he had to go somewhere else first. He had to go to the house of Hades, the Underworld, the place where the dead lived in their diminished condition, and find the shade of Tiresias the prophet, who alone among the dead had retained his intelligence and his ability to speak the truth about what was coming. Tiresias would tell him what he needed to know. Without that knowledge, the way home was closed. Odysseus asked how a living man sailed to the land of the dead, and Circe told him, and the instructions were precise enough and strange enough that he understood she had known this would be necessary before he arrived, perhaps long before. She gave them provisions and a following wind, the wind that steers toward the edge of the world where the sun does not reach and the rivers of the dead run into ocean. And the next morning the ship left Aea behind and moved north toward a coast that did not appear on any chart any of them had ever seen. Elpenor had died during the night before they sailed. He had been sleeping on the roof of Circe's house. It was warm enough to sleep outside, and the wine had been generous the evening before, and in the dark he had risen, or tried to, and had forgotten where he was, and had stepped off the wrong edge and fallen and broken his neck on the ground below. They found him in the morning, and there had been no time to bury him before the wind came. He sailed with them in the sense that his ghost did, ahead of the ship, already at the shore of the underworld before the living men arrived, waiting to be the first face Odysseus saw when he looked up from the ritual he had crossed the world to perform. Chapter 7: The Land of the Dead. The shore at the edge of ocean was not like other shores. It lay beyond the stream that encircled the world, past the point where the sun's light reached with any conviction, in a region Homer calls the land of the Cimmerians, a people who lived in perpetual mist and cloud, never seeing the sun at its rising or at its setting, just the dark pressing evenly from all directions in a way that was not quite night and not quite day, but something older than either. The ship beached itself, and Odysseus took the animals Circe had provided, a black ram and a black ewe, the colors the ritual required, and carried them inland to the place she had described, a rock where two rivers met, the river of fire and the river of lamentation running together into the larger darkness. He dug the pit with his sword, a cubit in each direction, not large, the size of something practical rather than ceremonial. He poured the libations in the order Circe had specified, honey and milk first, then sweet wine, then water, the whole surface of the pit covered and soaking into the earth, and over all of it he sprinkled the white barley. He prayed to the dead in the general way, to all of them, promising that when he reached Ithaca he would sacrifice his best heifer and burn good things for them on a pyre, and to Tiresias specifically he promised a black ram, the finest in his flock. Then he cut the throats of the two animals and let the blood run into the pit, and the dead began to come. They came from every direction, rising out of the earth with the slow accumulation of things that have been waiting a long time and are not entirely certain the waiting is over. Young men and old men and women and warriors still wearing the wounds that had killed them, and children and men who had gone into the sea. They pressed toward the pit and the blood, And Odysseus drew his sword and held them back, because Circe had told him this as well, that no shade could speak clearly until it had drunk from the pit, and that he must keep them from the blood until Tiresias had drunk first and delivered his prophecy. He stood over the pit with his sword, and the dead pressed around him in silence, and the silence of many people who cannot yet speak is its own particular kind of sound. Elpenor came first, before Tiresias, before anyone else, his body still unburied on Aea, his ghost arriving at the underworld faster than the living men had arrived by ship, the way the dead travel. He asked Odysseus not to leave him unmourned and unburied on the way back, and to plant his oar on his grave mound, so that men who came after would know a sailor lay there. Odysseus promised and meant it, and Elpenor withdrew to make room for what came next. Tiresias was old in the way that certain shades were old, the blindness that had defined him in life still on him, the white hair, the golden staff he carried because Persephone had given it to him as a mark of distinction among the dead, the one shade in the underworld who retained the full clarity of a living mind while everything around him had faded. He drank from the pit and raised his head and spoke with the directness of a man who had been delivering unwelcome truths for long enough that the discomfort of the recipient had ceased to concern him. He named Poseidon first, the source of the enmity, the cause of the wandering, the god whose anger would continue to shape everything until Odysseus reached home. He named Thrinacia, the island of the sun, and the cattle of Helios that grazed there in their perfection, untouchable, and he said this with the particular emphasis of a man who knows he is describing the thing most likely to go wrong. Leave the cattle alone. Whatever happens on that island, whatever hunger, whatever despair, whatever reasoning the men construct to justify taking what does not belong to them, leave the cattle alone. If the cattle are harmed, the ships will be destroyed and the men will die, and if Odysseus survives, it will be on a stranger's ship, late, alone, to find grief in his own house. He described the suitors. He described what Odysseus would find in Ithaca and what it would require of him to reclaim it, and he described it without softening. The men in the hall, the years of their occupation, the violence necessary to end it. He described the further journey afterward, the strange inland pilgrimage with an oar until he reached people who had never tasted salt and who would take the oar for a farming tool, and there the sacrifice to Poseidon, and there the end of the god's enmity, and after that a long life and a death from the sea, gentle and far from it at once. The prophecy ended where prophecies end, at the boundary of what the prophet is permitted to say. Tiresias withdrew, and the other shades came forward, and Odysseus let them drink in turn. His mother came, Anticlea, daughter of Autolycus, who had been alive when he left Ithaca for Troy, and who had died in his absence. He had not known she was dead. The news arrived not as news exactly, but as the fact of her presence here, among the shades, in this place where he had not expected to find her. She drank and recognized him and spoke, told him about Ithaca, about Penelope still holding the household together, about Telemachus growing and waiting, about his father Laertes, who had withdrawn from the town to his farm in his grief, and who lived roughly now, without comforts, sleeping on the ground in winter among the servants, mourning. She told him that what had killed her was not illness, but the wanting of him, the longing for her son, his news, his return, which had gone on long enough to become the kind of grief that does not leave room for anything else. 3 times Odysseus tried to embrace her. 3 times his arms closed on nothing, on the air that occupied the space where she appeared to be, on the shadow that had the shape of his mother, but not her substance. The dead in Homer are not held back from the living by any rule or prohibition. They simply have no body for the living to hold. He wept, and she spoke to him gently about this, explaining what it was, that when the life leaves the body, the sinews no longer hold the flesh and bones together, and what remains is like a dream, having the form of a person without any of the matter. She told him not to grieve excessively, to go back to the light, to remember what he had learned here and carry it home. Then the women came, the famous dead, Tiro and Antiope and Alcmene and others, a long line of women with histories attached to them, wives and daughters of great men, figures from the generations before Troy, whose stories Odysseus reported back to the living at Alcinous's court, with the patience of a man who understood he was being given something worth preserving. Then the men came, Agamemnon first, killed in his own bath by his wife and her lover on the very night of his homecoming, who warned Odysseus with the bitterness of the newly dead to never trust a woman fully and to land on Ithaca in secret rather than openly, which was practical advice born from the worst possible experience. Then Achilles. Achilles came with Patroclus beside him, and with Ajax at a distance, Ajax, who had lost the contest for Achilles' armor after Achilles' death, lost it to Odysseus, and who had not forgiven this even in the underworld, who turned away when Odysseus tried to speak to him and walked back into the darkness without answering. The wound between them, whatever could be said about its justice, had survived death entirely intact. But Achilles stopped. He drank and spoke, and the first thing he asked was for news of his son Neoptolemus. Where was he? What had he done? Had he distinguished himself at Troy after his father's death? Odysseus told him everything he knew about Neoptolemus, all of it good, the boy having arrived at Troy in his father's armor and conducted himself in a way that would have made Achilles proud, and the shade of Achilles listened to this with the particular attention of a father hearing about his child, the same attention a living father would have given it. Nothing about death had changed the quality of that interest. Then Odysseus offered what he meant as comfort, that Achilles ruled among the dead as a great king, that his authority here was not diminished, that he need not grieve his death when it had brought him such honor among the shades. Achilles answered with the most famous sentences in the poem, the ones that carry the whole theological weight of everything Homer thought about mortality and its value. He said he would rather be a servant, a landless man, laboring for wages on a poor farm, working for someone who had nothing himself, than be king of all the dead. He said it plainly, without self-pity, as a statement of what life was worth against what death offered, which was nothing except the form of what you had been, without the substance of it. This is the moment the Odyssey stakes its claim against the Iliad. Achilles in the Iliad chose death and glory over life and obscurity, and made the choice with full understanding of what it meant. Achilles in the Underworld, having made that choice and lived its consequence, tells Odysseus that the choice was wrong, not that he regrets it exactly. Regret requires an alternative still available, but that life, any life, even the worst life, contains something the best death does not. Odysseus, who had been choosing life over glory since the moment he left Troy, heard this and understood it as a kind of absolution. He tried to speak further with Achilles, but the shade withdrew into the asphodel meadow, moving quickly, pleased at what he had heard about his son, but carrying the full weight of what he was, which was the greatest warrior of his generation, existing now as a shadow of himself in a dim field, waiting with the patience of things that have nothing left to wait for. Then the crowd of the dead pressed harder toward the pit, and a terror came over Odysseus, the fear that Persephone might send up from the deeper dark something older and more dreadful than the heroic dead, the ancient monsters and the primordial figures whose presence in the underworld was not the same gentle diminishment, but something closer to the original power they had carried in life. He ran to the ship. His men were already at the oars, frightened by the length of the time he had been gone, and by the quality of the silence that had surrounded the ship since they landed, and they pulled for open water immediately, back along the river of ocean, back toward the coast where the sun's light returned gradually as the ship moved, back toward Aea and Circe and the world of the living that had never felt so specifically and urgently worth returning to. They buried Elpenor on the beach where they landed, raised his grave mound, set his oar upright at its crest, and Circe came down to the shore and spoke quietly with Odysseus through what remained of the night, telling him what came next, the Sirens, and what to do about them, the rocks and the passage between Scylla and Charybdis, Thrinacia and the cattle of the sun, about which she used the same tone of careful emphasis that Tiresias had used, which told Odysseus that this was the warning both the living and the dead agreed was most important. She sent them off at dawn with a following wind, and the ship moved south into clear weather, and the island fell behind them, and somewhere ahead the sea was making a sound unlike the sound of ordinary water, a sound that carried across the surface on the morning air with a sweetness that was already, even at this distance, difficult not to turn toward. Chapter 8. When Gods Argue. The Odyssey begins on Olympus, not at Troy, not at sea, not even on Ithaca, though Ithaca is where the poem's first earthly scene takes place, and it is from Ithaca that the human urgency of the story becomes visible. But before any of that, Homer places his reader among the gods, at a council where the central problem of the poem is being discussed with the mixture of genuine concern and political calculation that characterizes divine deliberation in the Homeric world. The gods in Homer are not omnipotent. They are powerful in specific domains, and within those domains their authority is real and their interventions have consequences. But they argue with each other, they require favorable conditions to act, they are blocked by each other's jurisdictions, and they operate within a system of permissions and prohibitions that looks, from a certain angle, remarkably like the court politics of a Bronze Age palace. What happens to Odysseus on the sea is not simply the weather. It is the outcome of a negotiation conducted above the clouds. Poseidon was away when Athena made her move. He had gone to the Ethiopians, a people who lived at the edge of the world and sacrificed to the gods with such quality and regularity that the Olympians made a habit of attending their festivals in person, which was an ancient tradition and a significant convenience for Athena, because Poseidon's absence from the assembly of the gods was the political opening she had been waiting for. She took it without hesitation. She stood before Zeus and made her case for Odysseus directly and without the kind of rhetorical indirection that divine petitions sometimes required when the petitioner was uncertain of the outcome. She knew her father's sympathies. She knew that Zeus had no particular investment in Poseidon's grievance against Odysseus, that the blinding of Polyphemus was a matter between a god and a mortal that Zeus had not authorized and did not feel bound to sustain indefinitely. What Athena offered was the argument that sufficient time had passed, that the punishment had been disproportionate in its duration, if not in its inception, and that a man of Odysseus's quality sitting on a goddess's island, weeping toward the horizon, was a waste that reflected poorly on divine governance generally. She made this last point carefully because Zeus was sensitive to implications about divine governance, but she made it. Zeus agreed. His agreement had conditions. Poseidon's enmity could not be simply cancelled because that would constitute an insult to the sea god's legitimate jurisdiction over his own domain, and Zeus managed Olympus through a careful system of respecting his brother's authority within their spheres, even when he disagreed with how they exercised it. What he could authorize was the next step. The decision had been made, he said, by the assembled gods in Poseidon's absence, that Odysseus would go home. Poseidon would be managed. Hermes would be sent to Calypso with instructions. This is the moment the poem officially begins its resolution, though the resolution will take the better part of 10 more books to complete. The divine decision precedes the human action throughout the Odyssey in a way that might seem to diminish Odysseus's agency if one reads it as determinism. The gods decide, the mortal follows. But Homer is more careful than that. The gods decide that Odysseus will go home. They do not decide how. They do not decide what it will cost him or what he will have to become before he gets there, or how many times he will have to survive something that should have killed him through the application of qualities no god supplied him. The permission is divine. The execution is entirely his. Hermes descended to Ogygia with the message, and Calypso received it with the particular bitterness of someone who has been overruled by a system they understood and resented simultaneously. She was a goddess. She had loved Odysseus genuinely, or as genuinely as the Homeric gods loved anyone, which was with a real intensity that was also inflected with possession, with the assumption that what a god wanted a god could keep. She had offered him immortality, not as a bargaining position, not as flattery, but as an actual proposal, the genuine thing, eternal life and eternal youth, beside a goddess on a beautiful island. He had declined it. This refusal was, in its quiet way, one of the most extraordinary moments in the poem, because what Odysseus turned down when he turned down immortality was the resolution of every problem mortality creates, the loss, the grief, the eventual failure of the body, all of it simply removed in favor of a specific mortal life that included all of those things. He wanted Ithaca. He wanted Penelope, who was aging and mortal and entirely capable of having remarried and forgotten him. He wanted the contingent, limited, irreversible life that was his own, with all of its contingency intact. Calypso made her speech to Hermes before she accepted the message, because acceptance did not require silence. She pointed out with a precision that the poem validates without resolving, that the gods maintained a double standard in these matters, that when a goddess loved a mortal man, the other gods intervened and separated them, citing propriety or necessity, or simply the preference of whoever held more authority at the moment, while when a god loved a mortal woman, the arrangement was generally permitted to continue without divine interference. She named specific cases. She made the argument clearly. Hermes did not dispute it. He said only that Zeus's instructions were Zeus's instructions, and that arguing with the instructions would cost her more than following them. She went to Odysseus on the shore and told him he could go. She told him she would help him build what he needed to make the crossing, and that she would provision it, and that she would give him a fair wind to start him. She offered one more time in the conversation that followed the immortality he had already refused, offered it again because she wanted him to understand clearly what he was choosing against, and perhaps because she wanted to hear him refuse it again in terms that would help her understand why. He refused it in exactly those terms. He knew Penelope was mortal and probably less beautiful than Calypso, and he was not pretending otherwise, and he wanted to go home anyway. The honesty of it was not comforting to her, but it was honest. She gave him tools, a great axe, an adze, an auger, and showed him where the timber was, and he worked for 4 days in the forest above the shore, cutting and shaping and fitting, with the competence of a man who had built things before and understood wood. 20 trees felled and trimmed and shaped into the hull and deck of a raft substantial enough to carry a man across open water, fitted with a mast and sail and steering oar, decked with planks and ringed with a wicker breastwork to break the waves. Calypso brought cloth for the sail and helped him rig it, and on the 5th morning she bathed him and clothed him and gave him provisions, bread and water and red wine, enough for the crossing, and sent him off with a warm wind from the west. He sailed for 17 days by the stars, keeping the bear on his left hand as Calypso had instructed, and on the 18th day the mountains of Scheria appeared on the horizon, and Poseidon returned from the Ethiopians. The sea god looked down from the mountains of the Solymi and saw the raft moving across the water, and what he felt was not simple anger, but something older and more considered, the irritation of someone who has maintained a position for years and now sees it being dismantled while he was attending a feast at the edge of the world. He had not been consulted. He had not agreed. The assembled gods had met in his absence and made a decision in his domain, which was technically within Zeus's authority and practically a significant insult, and the insult was visible on the water in the form of a Ithacan on a raft who should still have been sitting on Ogygia weeping. He raised his storm. The winds came from all quarters simultaneously, south and east and west and the cold north together, driving waves that peaked and broke over each other in the confused sea that forms when weather arrives from multiple directions at once. The raft was lifted and twisted and the sail torn away, and Odysseus was thrown into the water and held under, and came up and searched for the raft and found it and clung to it, while the sea moved around him with the intentional quality of a sea being managed by a god who wanted something specific to happen. Ino rose from the water. She had been a mortal woman once, a daughter of Cadmus, transformed into a sea deity after her death, and she rose now beside the raft in the form of a gannet and told Odysseus to abandon the raft and swim and take her veil and wrap it around his chest, and the veil would keep him afloat until he reached land. He hesitated, the hesitation of a practical man confronting advice that required him to trust something he could not evaluate, and the raft broke apart under him, and the decision was made for him, and he took the veil and swam. 2 days and 2 nights in the open sea. The waves drove him past Scheiria's rocky coast once, and he nearly drowned on the rocks, and Athena blunted the wave that would have destroyed him against the cliff face, and he found a river mouth at last and prayed to the river, and the current slackened and let him wade ashore. He crawled to the edge of the forest above the beach and buried himself in fallen leaves against the cold, 2 layers of leaves, deep enough to cover him entirely, the way a man buries a firebrand in ash at the edge of a field so it will still be burning in the morning, and slept. Athena went to the city of the Phaeacians while he slept and found the princess Nausicaa and stood beside her in the night in the form of a girl she knew, a friend from a neighboring house, and suggested in the easy way of dream logic that the next day would be an excellent day to bring the household laundry to the river, because a girl of Nausicaa's age and prospects really ought to have clean clothes available. Nausicaa woke in the morning thinking this was her own idea. On Ithaca, during all of this, during the years of the wandering, during the 7 years on Ogygia, during Calypso's veil and Poseidon's storm, and the raft breaking apart in the wine-dark sea, a household had been holding itself together by methods that were less dramatic than anything the sea had required, but no less demanding, sustained by a woman who had been managing an impossible situation for so long that the management had become its own form of heroism, largely invisible and entirely without an audience. Athena had been working there too, in the gaps between her interventions at sea, in the form of a family friend named Mentes, who appeared one afternoon at the door of Odysseus's hall and spoke to a young man named Telemachus about his father. Chapter 9: The Weaver's Work. Penelope had been making decisions for 20 years. This is the fact the poem circles without always stating directly, partly because Homer's original audiences would have understood it without being told, and partly because the poem's architecture keeps her at a certain distance, seen through doorways, glimpsed at the top of staircases, reported on by other characters who describe her grief and her beauty and her stubbornness with the mixture of admiration and frustration that powerful women reliably generate in the men who cannot quite manage them. But the distance is not diminishment. It is the distance of a character the poem trusts to be understood without being explained, and what she has been doing in Odysseus's absence is not waiting, it is governing. The distinction matters enormously, and the poem knows it even when its male characters do not. When Odysseus left for Troy, Telemachus was an infant and Laertes was still capable of managing the household's larger affairs, and the social architecture of a Bronze Age Greek kingdom provided Penelope with a reasonably clear role: wife of the absent king, mother of the heir, keeper of the interior of the house, while the exterior business of the kingdom ran through other hands. This arrangement held for perhaps the first decade. Then Laertes withdrew. The grief of a father who has lost a son to a war that will not end is its own particular kind of erosion, and Laertes eroded, retreated from the town to his farm in the hills above the harbor, slept among his servants, let the management of the estate's affairs pass to Penelope by default rather than by formal arrangement. Telemachus was a child and then a young adolescent, intelligent and observant, and largely powerless, watching the household that was legally his inheritance being consumed by men who had decided the king was dead and the succession was therefore open. The suitors had begun arriving in the second decade of Odysseus's absence, when it had become plausible to argue, as they argued, that a man missing for this long after a war that had officially ended was not a man who was coming back. They numbered, at their peak, over 100, sons of the leading families of Ithaca and the neighboring islands, Same and Dulichium and wooded Zacynthus, young men of property whose suit for Penelope's hand was also, in every practical sense, a suit for the kingdom of Ithaca. They moved into the hall. They killed Odysseus's livestock for their feasting, his cattle, his sheep, his goats, and drank his wine from his stores, and occupied his house with the comfortable confidence of people who had decided the formality of an actual decision was less important than the established fact of their presence. Every day they feasted. Every evening some of them stayed. The household servants who were loyal to Odysseus's memory watched and endured, and those who were not found accommodations with the new arrangement that suited them well enough. Penelope managed them for 3 years with the web. The loom held a burial shroud for Laertes. This was the claim, and it was a legitimate one, because Laertes was old and the shroud of a great man's father was not a trivial piece of work, but an elaborate textile that a woman of Penelope's position was expected to complete personally, and completing it properly could reasonably take some time. She told the suitors she would choose among them when the shroud was finished. She worked at the loom every day in the hall where they could see her working, steady and deliberate, the cloth growing in a way that seemed to confirm the project was progressing toward its conclusion. What they could not see was what happened each night when the hall was empty and the lamps were low, Penelope at the loom in the near dark, unpicking the day's work thread by thread, returning the cloth to what it had been the previous morning, so that the shroud was always in progress and never complete. The sheer technical labor of this ruse is worth pausing on, because it is easy to miss inside the myth's larger architecture. Weaving at the pace of a skilled woman working steadily was not a casual activity. It was hours of concentrated physical work, and then to undo those hours, carefully enough that the undoing was invisible in the morning's light, required equal concentration and a steadiness of purpose that did not waver for 3 years. 3 years of weaving and unraveling every day and every night, sustained by a woman who could not know whether the ruse would hold long enough to matter, or whether Odysseus was alive to matter too. The web was not a passive delay. It was an active, daily, exhausting act of resistance, and it held for 3 years before a disloyal maidservant, one of the women who had found her accommodation with the suitor's presence, told them what happened to the cloth at night. The suitors compelled Penelope to finish the shroud. She finished it. The formal pretext that had given her 3 years of recognized refusal was gone, and what replaced it was a situation with no clear legitimate mechanism for further delay, which is to say a situation that required a different kind of management. Telemachus was approaching 20 at this point, and the relationship between him and the suitors had been deteriorating for some time, in the way of relationships where one party has all the formal rights and none of the practical power, and the other party has all the practical power and no interest in acknowledging the formal rights. The suitors were not physically violent toward Telemachus in the early period. He was the heir nominally, and open violence against him would have created a different kind of problem. But they were contemptuous, and contempt applied continuously over years to a young man still forming himself is its own kind of damage. Antinous was the worst of them in this respect, the one whose treatment of Telemachus had the particular nastiness of someone who understood exactly where the wound was and returned to it for pleasure. Eurymachus was more dangerous, smoother, more intelligent, the one who could be charming to Penelope while running the suitors' collective strategy with real political calculation. Athena had come to Ithaca as Mentes some time before the events at Scheria, arriving at the hall in the form of an old family friend, a Taphian captain, and found Telemachus sitting among the suitors' feast, with the specific misery of someone who could see clearly what was wrong and could not do anything about it. She spoke to him as Mentes would speak, with the ease of long acquaintance, with the assumption that he was capable of more than he was currently displaying, and she told him that his father was alive, that she was certain of it, and that a young man in Telemachus's position ought to be doing something about his household rather than sitting in it watching it be consumed. She suggested he call an assembly of the Ithacans and make a public case against the suitors' behavior, and then sail to Pylos and Sparta to ask Nestor and Menelaus whether they had news of Odysseus. The assembly would likely accomplish little, she acknowledged, but the sailing would accomplish something harder to name: the transformation of a young man who had been passive into a young man who had acted, which changes what a person is capable of afterward. He called the assembly. It was the first assembly of Ithacans since Odysseus had sailed for Troy, and its very convening was a statement about Telemachus's intentions that the suitors read correctly and resented. He stood before the gathered Ithacans and make his case: the suitors in his father's house, the waste of the estate, his mother unable to refuse them and unable to choose among them, the impossibility of a situation that the islanders had been watching develop for years without intervention. The suitors responded through Antinous with the argument they had been making privately for some time, that the problem was Penelope's refusal to choose, that if she would simply declare Odysseus dead and marry one of them, the situation would resolve itself cleanly, and that until she did, the inconveniences of the current arrangement were essentially her own creation. It was a dishonest argument and a clever one, and the assembly dissolved without resolution because the Ithacans were not going to challenge 100 armed men from noble families over a principle, however valid the principle was. Telemachus sailed anyway. He went to Pylos and sat at Nestor's table and heard the old king's long account of the fleet's dispersal after Troy, who had made it home safely, who had not, what storms had hit which ships, and learned that Menelaus was back in Sparta after years of his own wandering and might know more. He went to Sparta and sat in Menelaus's extraordinary house, which still glittered with the wealth of Helen's recovery, and Menelaus told him what the old sea god Proteus had told him at the Egyptian coast, that Odysseus was alive on an island, held by a goddess unable to leave. This was not current intelligence. Menelaus had heard it years before, but it was something. It was confirmation that the assumption the suitors had been building their occupation on was not a certainty, and Telemachus carried this back toward Ithaca with the careful attention of someone who has found a fragile thing and does not want to drop it. The suitors had planned to ambush him on the passage home, had positioned a ship in the straits between Ithaca and Same to intercept him, because a Telemachus who had sailed to Pylos and Sparta and returned with news of his father was a more dangerous Telemachus than the one who had left, and Antinous understood this with the accuracy of someone who had been calculating the household's power dynamics for years. Athena routed the ship around the ambush without Telemachus knowing entirely how he had avoided it, and he landed on Ithaca's shore at dawn and went directly to the hut of the swineherd Eumaeus in the hills before he went anywhere else. Penelope, in the hall below, did not yet know her son was back. She did not yet know that on a shore somewhere to the north, a man had washed himself in a river and was pulling leaves out of his hair and looking at a landscape that was not Ithaca, but was at least solid ground, and that Athena was already arranging the next thing, the way she arranged everything, from a distance, through other people, setting conditions rather than determining outcomes, trusting that the man she had been managing toward this shore for 20 years would, once he reached it, know what to do. He had always known what to do. The knowing had never been the problem. Chapter 10. Ogygia. In the 7th year, Odysseus was still going to the shore every morning. This is the image the poem plants early and returns to here, now that the chronicle has caught up to it. The man on the beach, the horizon, the daily ritual of sitting with his grief in the one place on the island where the grief had a direction to point. Calypso's island was beautiful in ways that the poem takes care to specify, because the beauty matters to the argument the episode is making. Alders and poplars and fragrant cypresses ringed the cave where she lived, and grapevines ran heavy along the rock face above the entrance, and 4 springs ran clear from a central source in 4 directions through meadows thick with violets and wild celery. Birds nested in the cypresses, owls and hawks and the long-tongued sea crows that feed along the shore. Even Hermes, arriving on divine business with no particular reason to linger, paused at the edge of the clearing and looked around and acknowledged inwardly that this was remarkable. The gods were not easily impressed by beauty, having the capacity to make it themselves, but Ogygia impressed even Hermes. Odysseus was not in the clearing when Hermes arrived. He was on the shore. 7 years is a measurement that requires a moment's consideration. He had been at Troy for 10 years before the wandering began, and the wandering itself, the Cicons and the Lotus Eaters and the Cyclops and Aeolus and the Laestrygonians and Circe and the Underworld and everything that followed, had consumed roughly 3 years before the storm that threw him onto Calypso's shore. So when Hermes descended to Ogygia, Odysseus had been away from Ithaca for 17 years. Telemachus, the infant he had left in his wife's arms when the obligation to Agamemnon's war pulled him away from the harbor, was 17 years old and sitting in a hall full of men who wanted his father's house. Penelope had been managing the suitors for 3 years already. Laertes was an old man on a farm, sleeping rough, mourning. And the cause of all of it was sitting on a beach on a perfect island, weeping into the Ionian Sea. The weeping was not despair, or not only despair. Homer is careful about this distinction too. Odysseus ate Calypso's food and slept in Calypso's bed and lived inside the rhythms of her hospitality, with the compliance of a man who understood he had no alternative, but he did not pretend to himself that any of it was what he wanted, and the shore was where the pretending became impossible, and he allowed himself to know clearly what he was and where he was not. The grief of a man who can see what he wants and cannot reach it is a specific grief, different from the grief of loss or the grief of failure, and it requires a specific witness, in this case the empty horizon and the sea beyond it and whatever lay beyond the sea. He wept there every morning and then went back to the cave and ate dinner and was present in the ways presence was required of him, and then the next morning went back to the shore. 7 years of this. Calypso loved him. This too Homer states with a directness that resists easy dismissal, because the poem does not present Calypso as deluded or purely possessive. She is a goddess who found in this specific mortal man something she had not found elsewhere, and she had kept him on her island with the combination of genuine feeling and divine authority that makes a goddess's hospitality impossible to decline. She was the daughter of Atlas, the Titan who held up the sky, which placed her in a genealogy of enormous and fundamental power, and she had exercised that power in the most intimate possible way by simply not permitting Odysseus to leave. Not through force, not through enchantment, but through the practical fact that there was no ship on Ogygia and no way off the island without her assistance, and she had not assisted. She had offered him immortality honestly. The offer appears in the poem twice. Once when Hermes arrives and she goes to find Odysseus on the shore, once earlier in the background of the episode, and it was not a negotiating position. Eternal life, eternal youth, the permanent version of the comfort and beauty she had already provided for 7 years, and beside her rather than beside an aging mortal woman on a rocky island who might not even have waited. She laid the comparison out plainly, acknowledging that Penelope was mortal and would age and eventually die, and that she herself was neither, and asking him to weigh this honestly. He weighed it honestly and told her that Penelope probably was more beautiful in many ways, and that he missed his home with a force that could not be reasoned against, and that he would rather face whatever the sea and Poseidon had left to give him than spend eternity in a place that was not Ithaca. The refusal was not heroic in the way the heroic tradition understood heroism. It was not a refusal of comfort in favor of glory, or a sacrifice of safety in favor of honor. It was the refusal of everything in favor of a specific ordinary life, a specific harbor, a specific bed, a specific woman, and its insistence on the particular over the infinite is the quietest and most radical thing Odysseus does in the entire poem. Hermes had found Calypso in the cave, weaving at her loom and singing, the same image Eurylochus had found at Circe's house, which is perhaps Homer's way of suggesting something about the domestic arrangements of divine women who live alone, or perhaps simply the image a poet reaches for when he needs to establish that a woman is home. Hermes delivered Zeus's message with the diplomatic care of a messenger who knows the news is unwelcome and does not wish to be the thing the recipient's anger lands on. He explained that Zeus had authorized Odysseus's departure, that Poseidon's enmity would have to be accommodated rather than resolved, that Calypso was being asked to help the mortal build a raft and provision it and send him on his way. Calypso received this with the bitterness she was entitled to and expressed it in the speech that is one of the poem's more quietly devastating moments. She said what was true, that the gods saw no difficulty when one of their number loved a mortal woman and kept her, but that when a goddess loved a mortal man, the permission was reliably revoked at the first opportunity. She named Eos and Orion, and Dawn's love for Orion that the gods had ended. She named others. The examples held. Hermes offered no counter-argument because there was none available. He said only that it would be wise to comply with Zeus's instructions, and the wisdom of complying with Zeus's instructions was not really in question. She went to the shore and told Odysseus he could go. She told him the decision had been made and that she would help him and provision him and give him a wind. He was suspicious, in the way of a man who has been held somewhere for 7 years and is being told the door is open, and asked her to swear the oath of the gods that this was not a trick, that she was not sending him out to sea to arrange a different kind of ending for him than the one Poseidon had been providing. She swore the oath without offense, understanding why he asked, and they went back to the cave together, and she fed him, and they talked through the evening. In the morning she led him to the timber and gave him tools and left him to the work. The forest above the shore was full of dry seasoned timber, alders and poplars and firs, tall and well grown, and he felled 20 trees and trimmed them and shaped them with the adze and bored them with the auger and fitted them together with the practiced efficiency of a man who had built things before and found physical work clarifying. Calypso brought him cloth for the sail and helped him rig the mast and the yard, and in 4 days the raft was done, decked with planks, fitted with a steering oar, braced with a wicker bulwark along its sides against the waves. It was not a ship. It was a raft substantial enough to cross open water, which was what the crossing required and what he had available. She bathed him and dressed him on the morning of the 5th day, and loaded the raft with provisions, a skin of dark wine, a larger skin of water, a bag of food, bread and dried meat, and sent him off with a warm and steady wind from the west. He sat at the steering oar and watched the island fall behind him and did not look back, or if he did, Homer does not record it. He navigated by the stars for 17 nights, keeping the bear on his left as Calypso had instructed, watching the Pleiades and the late-setting Buddhas, and the sea was cooperative in the way that seas are cooperative when no god is actively attending to them. On the 18th day, the mountains of Scheria darkened the horizon ahead of him, rising from the sea like a promise, and he was close enough to make out the lower slopes and the tree line when the weather changed. Poseidon had been at the Ethiopians' feast when the gods decided to let Odysseus go. He came back from the feast in the good temper that excellent hospitality produces, and looked down at the ocean from the mountains of the Solimai and saw the raft, and the good temper became something else. He had maintained his position for 17 years. He had kept this mortal at a sufficient distance from home that the mortal's famous endurance had become instead a famous grief, and now the assembled gods had met while he was at dinner and reversed it, and the reversal was crossing the sea on a raft made of Calypso's timber. He sent everything he had left to give: the staff of clouds, the trident stirring the deep water, all four winds arriving simultaneously from their corners, south and east, and north and west together, the sea rising in every direction at once, the raft twisting and lifting, and the sail driving it sideways before it tore away entirely. A wave took Odysseus off the deck and held him under for what felt longer than it was, and released him. And he came up and found the raft and climbed back onto it and clung. Ino came up from the water in the form of a gannet, a seabird, gray and efficient, landing on the raft's edge beside him. She had been Leothea once, a mortal woman, before the sea had taken her into its permanent employ, and she watched the storm working on the raft with the assessment of someone who understood both the sea's business and Poseidon's specific intentions, and she held out her veil. "Take it," she said, "wrap it around your chest, and it will hold you up, and when you reach land, cast it back into the sea without looking." Then she was gone, back into the water in the gannet's form. He hesitated with the veil in his hands, in the reasonable way of a man being asked to trust an object given to him by a seabird in the middle of a divine storm, and while he hesitated, a wave took the raft apart. The decision was made. He wrapped the veil around his chest and went into the water and swam. 2 days and 2 nights. The mountains of Scheria ahead of him, no closer it seemed for all the swimming, until on the 3rd day the wind shifted and the current ran toward the island, and the coast was suddenly close, close enough to hear the surf breaking on the rocks below the cliffs, too close, the rocks reaching up through the water as the swell lifted him toward them. He caught a rock with both hands and held, while the backwash tried to pull him off it, and held, and the next wave threw him at the cliff face, and Athena blunted the wave at the last moment, and he slid along the rock face searching for the river mouth, and found it, and the fresh water met him and slowed and let him wade to the bank. He crawled to the trees and dug himself into the leaf fall under 2 olive trees that grew together above the bank, piling the dry leaves over him until they covered him entirely, and his body decided it had done what was required of it, and he slept before he had finished the thought. The island above him was quiet. Inland, past the river and the forest, there was a city, walls and harbor and houses, and a palace with gold and silver dogs at the gate. And in the palace a girl was sleeping with whatever dream Athena had given her, about laundry and river mornings, and the presentable state a young woman of her position ought to maintain. Nausicaa would wake with the sun, with the pleasant certainty that this had been her own idea all along. Chapter 11. Scheria. Nausicaa woke certain about the laundry. She went to her parents' room before breakfast, to Alcinous her father, who agreed to everything she asked with the easy generosity of a man who had never found it difficult to be generous, and to Arete her mother, whose agreement mattered more and was given more carefully. The mule cart was loaded with the household linens, the great unwashed accumulation of a palace's domestic life, and Nausicaa drove it through the city and down to the river mouth where the washing pools lay above the beach, her companions riding with her, all of them in the good mood of young women given a legitimate reason to spend a day outside the palace walls. They washed the linens and spread them on the clean pebbles above the waterline to dry in the sun, and ate their lunch, And when the afternoon had softened into the easy hours before evening, they played ball on the beach, the kind of unself-conscious play that happens when no one is watching and the work is done and the light is pleasant. Nausicaa threw, and one of her companions missed, and the ball went into the river, and the shriek that followed it woke Odysseus in his pile of leaves. He lay still for a moment, assembling the situation from what he could hear: voices, young, female, no sound of weapons or alarm. He was naked, salt-crusted, covered in dried river mud and leaf fragments, having spent 2 days in the open sea and a night buried under dead leaves, and he understood clearly that his appearance was going to present a social problem that would require careful management. He considered briefly and picked up a leafy branch from the undergrowth to hold before him and walked out of the trees toward the voices. The companions ran. This was entirely reasonable, given what emerged from the forest. Nausicaa did not run, which was either exceptional courage or exceptional confidence, or the intervention of Athena steadying her feet. Homer suggests all three simultaneously, and she stood on the beach and watched the apparition approach and waited to hear what it had to say for itself. What it said was extraordinary. Odysseus had not spoken to a person in 17 days at sea, and however many weeks before that on Ogygia, and the instrument was rusty, but the skill was intact, and the skill was the one he had been deploying since Troy, whenever a situation required something other than a sword. He told her she was beautiful, which was true, and compared her to a young palm tree he had once seen growing beside Apollo's altar on Delos, which was the kind of comparison that arrives in the mind of a man who has genuinely seen many remarkable things and retains them in good order. He told her his situation plainly: shipwrecked, alone, in need of clothing and directions to the city. He asked for nothing more than a scrap of cloth and a word of guidance, and he framed the ask as a petition to her as a goddess, leaving her the choice of how to receive it. The framing was not dishonest. She was a princess on a beach, and she received it as a princess would, with the pleasure of someone being addressed at the right level and the practical intelligence to assess the situation correctly. She gave him clothing from the cart's provisions and oil for his skin, and sent her companions to help him wash in the river while she withdrew to wait. He bathed and oiled himself and dressed, and Athena adjusted what the clothing covered, made him taller, broader, the gray worn out of his face, and the exhaustion lightened from around his eyes, because there was a social transaction coming that would go better if the man conducting it looked like the kind of man one might plausibly receive at court. Nausicaa looked at him when he came back from the river and said to her companions, quietly, that she would not object if a man like this wanted to stay in Scheria. She drove the cart back to the city and told Odysseus to follow on foot, a distance behind, because a foreign man arriving in the city alongside the princess would generate the kind of talk that caused problems she did not need. She gave him directions to the palace and instructions for how to approach it. Go directly to her mother Arete, she said. Take her hands before her father's, because Arete's judgment was the one that governed the household's response to strangers, and if Arete found him worthy of assistance, he would have everything he needed. The advice was precise and practical, and given with the ease of someone who understood the politics of her own family. He followed the road into the city at dusk and found a young woman at the fountain, Athena in the form of a girl carrying a water jar, who walked him to the palace gate and told him what he was about to see and how to behave inside it, and then disappeared into the evening crowd before he could ask her name. The palace of Alcinous was the kind of structure that makes a man stop walking and simply look. Walls of bronze rising from the threshold, and above them a cornice of dark enamel, and golden doors hung on silver posts above a silver threshold, and on either side of the doorway golden dogs that Hephaestus had made with divine craft to guard the house of the great-hearted Alcinous, immortal dogs, ageless, that had been at their posts since the god made them, and would remain when everyone inside the palace was long gone. Inside, golden youths on pedestals held torches that lit the hall through the night. The orchards beyond the courtyard held pear trees and pomegranates and apple trees and figs and olives, bearing continuously, fruit ripening while other fruit was still in flower, because Zephyr's breath quickened some and ripened others simultaneously in the garden that never went out of season. Odysseus walked through it in his borrowed clothes and went directly to Arete. She was sitting by the fire spinning purple wool, and Alcinous was beside her, and the lords of the Phaeacians were ranged around the hall. Odysseus took her hands and stated his petition. He named himself a suppliant, asked for passage home, and sat in the ashes of the hearth, in the custom of those who came seeking mercy. There was a silence in the hall, and then an old lord spoke about the laws of hospitality, and Alcinous raised Odysseus from the hearth, and seated him in his own chair, and ordered food and wine, and the feast was arranged, and the petition was accepted, before a single formal question had been asked. They asked questions afterward, over days. Alcinous asked Odysseus his name and his origin, gently, the way a careful host asks, not demanding, but making space for the answer. And Odysseus gave him both, and the assembled Phaeacian lords sat very still, because the name was one they knew from the songs. The bard Telemachus had already been among them at this feast, or at an earlier one, the blind singer who sat at his silver-studded chair in the hall and sang whatever the muse placed in him, and what the muse had placed in him at the feast before Odysseus revealed himself was the quarrel between Achilles and Odysseus at Troy. This song requires a moment's attention. Telemachus sang of a dispute at a divine feast early in the war, where Achilles and Odysseus had argued about whether Troy would fall by force or by strategy, whether the direct assault of the greatest warrior would be decisive, or whether the cunning of the cleverest commander would be what finally broke the city. Agamemnon had been pleased by this argument, the poem suggests, because a prophecy had told him Troy would fall when the best of the Greeks quarreled in exactly this way, and the quarrel meant Troy was within reach. The audience in Alcinous's hall listened to this with the pleasure that audiences take in a story they already know, and Odysseus drew his purple cloak up over his head and hid his face. He wept into the cloak. He wept quietly, well controlled, visible only to Alcinous, who was sitting near enough to see the shoulders moving under the cloth. Nobody else saw. The hall went on feasting, Telemachus went on singing, and Odysseus sat with his face covered and wept at a song about himself, sung by a blind man who had no idea he was in the room. There is something in this moment that the poem does not gloss. The experience of hearing your own history rendered into song by someone who was not there condensed into the form that audiences find beautiful and memorable, stripped of the interior weather that made it what it actually was to live it. Odysseus had been at that feast. He had been in that argument. He knew what the argument had felt like from inside it, and the song was not wrong exactly, but it was the shape of the thing rather than the thing, and the distance between those two produced in him, on a full stomach in a warm hall with a cloak he could pull over his face, 20 years of everything he had been holding. Alcinous noticed and called for the singing to stop and suggested they go outside for the games, which was a gracious way of giving a guest a reason to put down his cloak. The games were the Phaeacians' great recreation. They were not fighters and had no interest in war, but they ran and wrestled and threw the discus with the enthusiasm of people who had turned competition inward, away from enemies, toward the pleasure of testing themselves against each other. They were extraordinary sailors, and their ships were their pride, and when one young lord, Aeolus, looking for something to say, suggested that the stranger seemed more like a merchant than an athlete, Odysseus picked up the largest discus on the field and threw it further than anyone else had thrown that day, one-handed, without removing his cloak. He then offered to compete at anything else available, with the possible exception of running, because his legs were still somewhat damaged from the sea. Aeolus apologized with the specific embarrassment of someone who has misjudged a situation badly in public. Demodocus sang again that evening, a lighter song this time, the love of Ares and Aphrodite, Hephaestus's net, the gods laughing in the captured light, and the hall relaxed into the evening that follows a day well spent, and Odysseus asked Demodocus to sing of the Trojan horse, which the bard did not hesitate to do, because it was one of the great songs, the hollow wooden horse that the Greeks had built at Odysseus's suggestion, and filled with their best men, and left on the beach before the city, while the fleet pretended to sail away. Demodocus sang it beautifully. He sang the Trojans dragging it inside the walls, and the debate about what to do with it, and the night the Greeks came out of it, in the dark of the city that thought it had finally won. Odysseus wept again, more openly this time, and this time Alcinous saw clearly and stopped the song and asked his guest who he was. He told them everything. He spoke from that evening through the night and into the next day, the full account of the wandering, Ismarus, the Lotus eaters, the Cyclops, Aeolus, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the Underworld, what came after, and the Phaeacian lords sat and listened in the way that audiences listen to a story they can feel is true, which is differently from how they listen to a song, with a different kind of stillness. When he finished, it was morning, and Alcinous said nothing for a moment, and then said that Odysseus had the gifts of a storyteller as well as a warrior, which was a Phaeacian's highest possible compliment, and that he would be taken home. The gifts were assembled, bronze and gold and fine cloth from each of the Phaeacian lords, loaded into the ship, and the feast was held and the libations poured, and at evening Odysseus went aboard and lay down in the stern on the bedding they had spread for him, and the Phaeacian oarsmen took their benches. These were the ships that needed no helmsman and could travel at the speed of thought, and they pulled out of the harbor and into the open sea, and the speed came up until the bow wave was a continuous ridge of white water, and the hull hummed against the current, and Odysseus slept the way he had not slept since before Troy, deeply, without watch, without planning, carried by people who had no reason to want anything from him except his safe arrival. He was asleep when they reached Ithaca in the gray hour before dawn. They carried him ashore still sleeping, with his gifts around him, and laid him in the sand below an olive tree at the entrance to a harbor he had not seen in 20 years, and went back to their ship and departed. Poseidon saw the ship returning to Scheria and asked Zeus for the one thing he had left to ask: permission to punish the Phaeacians for their hospitality, for ferrying the mortal he had spent 17 years opposing across the last stretch of water. Zeus gave him permission for half of what he wanted, not to destroy the ship and its crew, but to turn it to stone at the harbor mouth as it came in, so the Phaeacians and all who watched from the shore would understand that there were limits to what mortal hospitality could accomplish against divine will. Poseidon struck the ship at the harbor entrance, and it became a rock, and the Phaeacians gathered on the shore and looked at it, and Alcinous recognized the ancient prophecy that had warned of exactly this, and they sacrificed to Poseidon and prayed and went back to their city, and that was the last time the Phaeacians carried a stranger home across the sea. The gifts lay in a heap beside the olive tree on Ithaca's beach. The man among them was still sleeping, and around him the island was waking into an ordinary morning. Fishermen on the water, goats on the hillside, smoke beginning from the houses above the harbor, and a woman in the hall that overlooked the harbor was already at the loom or had never left it, working in the early light with the focused patience of someone who had been waiting a very specific person's arrival for 20 years. He would not go to her directly. He would go to the swineherd first. He would go disguised and patient, the way he had always gone into the difficult places, as nobody, and he would learn the shape of what had grown in his absence before he let it know he was there. Chapter 12. Stringing the Bow. The bow had been in the storeroom for 20 years. Penelope knew exactly where it was. She had walked past the storeroom door for 2 decades with the knowledge of what lay inside it, the way a person carries the knowledge of an old wound, not thought about constantly, but never entirely absent, present in the quality of attention that moves around rather than through a certain part of the house. The storeroom was off the main hall, cedar-scented and dim, its floor deep with the accumulated gifts of guest friends and the stored wealth of a household that had been prosperous before 100 men began eating it from the inside. The bow lay there with its curved horns and its quiver of bronze-tipped arrows, wrapped in a cloth, exactly as Odysseus had left it. It had come to him from Iphitus, son of Eurytus of Ocalia, given in Messene when Odysseus was still a young man on a diplomatic errand, the two of them meeting by chance, finding in each other the qualities that produce genuine friendship quickly, exchanging gifts in the custom of guest friendship that was the Bronze Age world's primary mechanism for building trust across distance. Iphitus gave the bow. Odysseus gave a sword and a spear. Iphitus was killed shortly afterward by Heracles, who murdered him for his horses in a crime the poem names without excusing, and the bow became the last object Iphitus ever touched, which gave it a weight beyond its physical weight. Odysseus had taken it to Troy and then had not, had left it in the storeroom when the fleet sailed, kept it back as if some part of him understood that this bow belonged to the life he was returning to rather than the life he was leaving for. No one else had ever strung it. Penelope went to the storeroom alone, or nearly alone. Eurynome and another serving woman came with her, because a woman of her position did not move through her own house in complete isolation. But the decision to go was hers, and the moment of standing before the chest that held the bow was hers. She lifted the lid and found it under the cloth and held it for a moment with both hands, and Homer notes that she wept briefly, then composed herself, because Penelope in the poem does not weep for long when there is something to be done. She carried it out to the hall where the suitors were assembled and told them what the contest would be. The axes would be set in a row the length of the hall, 12 of them, each with a hole in the head through which an arrow must pass cleanly, all 12 in sequence, in a single shot. Any man who could string the bow and make that shot would have her hand. She set the contest herself, in her own words, with the suitors watching, and then went back upstairs to her room because she did not particularly want to watch what followed. Telemachus set the axes. He dug the trench for them himself, measured and aligned them with the care of someone who found it useful to be doing something physical, and when they were set, he tried the bow himself, 3 attempts to string it, bending it against his knee the way a buyer tests a finished weapon, the string refusing to seat on the upper horn each time. He would have managed it on the 4th attempt. His hands were finding the shape of the problem, the particular combination of force and angle the bow required, the knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind and arrives incrementally. He looked up on the 3rd attempt and caught his father's eye across the hall, the beggar in the corner, the ragged stranger who had been given a place by the door, and something passed between them, and Telemachus set the bow down and said he was not strong enough, and laughed and told the suitors to try. They tried in order of rank, which meant Antinous and Eurymachus went last, and the men between them went first, and failed first in ways that ranged from the publicly humiliating to the merely insufficient. The bow was warmed at the fire between attempts to make it more supple and rubbed with fat, and still it would not yield. These were not weak men. They were the sons of leading families, young and well-fed and accustomed to physical competition. But the bow was not a bow that could be strung by familiarity with other bows. It had a specific character, a specific resistance, that 20 years of a particular man's absence had kept intact, as if the weapon had been waiting for the hands that knew it. Eurymachus tried last among the middle rank. He was the cleverest of the suitors and the most dangerous in Odysseus's absence, the one who had managed the political situation in the hall with the most sophistication, and his failure at the bow was therefore the most significant failure, not merely physical but revelatory, because it made visible in front of the entire assembly the gap between what the suitors had claimed and what they were. He had been presenting himself for years as a man capable of filling the space Odysseus had left. The bow demonstrated otherwise without argument. He set it down and said, with the surface composure of someone holding their face together by effort, that it was a shameful thing, not for himself, but for the story that would be told about this generation of men, that they could not string the bow of Odysseus. The shame was real. The attempt to distribute it across the generation rather than locate it in himself was characteristic. Antinous proposed the delay. A feast day was coming, Apollo's festival, the god of the bow, and it was inappropriate to strain at the bow on a god's holy day, he said, and they should set it aside until tomorrow and sacrifice to Apollo and try again with the god's blessing. It was a plausible argument and a face-saving one, and everyone in the hall understood both things simultaneously. The bow was set against a pillar. The beggar by the door asked if he could try. The eruption this produced was immediate and loud and came from multiple directions at once. Antinous was furious in the way of someone who had just managed a social situation with some skill and has watched it be destabilized by an unexpected variable. He said that the wine had made the beggar forget himself, that a man of his condition had no business touching the bow of Odysseus, and that if the beggar somehow managed to string it, which he would not, Penelope would obviously not marry him, which was an argument that had the interesting quality of being both correct and completely beside the point. Other suitors joined in. The hall tilted toward noise. Telemachus cut through it. He said that the bow was his to give to whoever he chose, and that if he wished to give it to the stranger to try, the stranger would try, and his mother could go upstairs. His voice had the quality it had been developing since the assembly and the voyage and the months of Athena's patient instruction, the quality of a man who has decided to act like his father's son, regardless of whether that claim is challenged, and whose decision is not a performance, but a settled thing. Penelope looked at him with the specific attention of a mother seeing her child be who she had always hoped he would be, and went upstairs as told, because Telemachus was right that the bow was his to give. Eumaeus carried it across the hall. His hands were shaking. He had been in the hall all day as part of the plan arranged the day before, he and Phaeacians the cowherd, both of them now knowing who the beggar was and what was about to happen. And the shaking was not fear, but the particular trembling of someone who has been loyal for 20 years in the dark and is now watching the moment that loyalty was for come into being in front of them. He set the bow in the beggar's hands. Euryclea had already locked the women in the inner courtyard. Phaeacians had slipped out and secured the outer gate. Odysseus turned the bow in his hands for a long moment. He examined it the way a craftsman examines a familiar tool found after a long absence, checking the horns for worm damage, testing the flexibility, running his fingers along the wood with the attention of someone reacquainting themselves with a specific object they have known for a long time. The suitors watched this and made the jokes that people make when they want to seem unbothered and are not entirely succeeding. He took the string and strung the bow without apparent effort, the way a man strings a familiar lyre, one smooth motion, the string seating cleanly on the upper horn, and plucked it once to test the note. The note rang through the hall like a swallow's cry, Homer says, clean and high and carrying, the sound of a well-made instrument correctly strung. It was the sound of something resuming. He reached for an arrow from the quiver that lay beside him on the ground. He had not stood up, had not moved from where he sat, and knocked it to the string and sighted along the line of axes and released it. The arrow went through all 12 heads cleanly, the bronze tip emerging from the last ring without deflection, and buried itself in the wall beyond. He looked at Telemachus. Telemachus looked at him. The suitors were still processing what they had just watched, the brain's brief delay between seeing something and understanding what it means. And in that delay, Odysseus stood up and stepped to the threshold of the hall and turned the bow on Antinous. Antinous was lifting a cup of wine. This is the detail Homer gives: the cup on its way to his mouth, the ordinary gesture of a man at a feast who does not yet know the feast is over. The arrow took him in the throat, and he went backward off his bench, and the cup fell, and the wine ran across the floor, and the hall understood all at once what was happening. The suitors reached for their weapons and found the weapons gone. Telemachus had removed them the night before, carried them to the storeroom, a detail arranged in advance with the calm preparation of people who had been planning this for longer than the suitors had been comfortable. Eurymachus tried the argument that Antinous had led them wrong, that the blame was Antinous', that if Antinous was dead, the grievance was satisfied. It was a reasonable argument in other circumstances. Odysseus told him that the inheritance eaten and the men occupying his house, and the years of the occupation were not a debt that ended with one man's death, and Eurymachus drew his sword and charged, and the second arrow was already in the air. What happened in the hall after that was not quick, and it was not clean, but it was complete. Telemachus had gone for spears and armor from the storeroom, and came back with equipment for himself and Eumaeus and Phaeacians, and the four of them held the hall against 100 men with the advantage of position and preparation and the quality that comes from fighting for something rather than fighting to keep something taken. The suitors had no armor. It was in the storeroom, and the hall had only one entrance, and Odysseus stood at it. A goatherd who was loyal to the suitors managed to find a back way to the storeroom and brought out some arms, and there was a period of genuine danger, but Athena was in the hall in the form of Mentor, and her presence did what her presence always did: arrange the conditions rather than determining the outcome, kept the balance where the balance needed to be kept. When it was over, Odysseus called for the loyal servants and for Euryclea, and he stood in the hall with the bow still in his hand and the floor in the state that halls are in when something irrevocable has happened in them, and he breathed, and he was Odysseus in his own house for the first time in 20 years. Euryclea was already going up the stairs to wake Penelope, moving with the speed of an old woman who has been waiting for this errand for 2 decades and is not going to let age slow her now that it has arrived. Chapter 13: The Beggar at the Door. Athena aged him on the shore before he took a single step toward the city. The transformation was thorough, and it was deliberate, and it was in its way a kind of homecoming gift from the goddess, who understood her charge better than anyone, because the first thing Odysseus needed to do on Ithaca was not to be Odysseus. He needed to be a man the island did not recognize, a wandering beggar of indeterminate origin, old and ragged and carrying a staff and a battered leather sack, with the kind of face that people look past rather than at. Athena withered his skin and dimmed his eyes and pulled the color from his hair and gave him the clothes that complete the picture: filthy tunic, a great stag's skin thrown over it, worn through at the shoulders. He looked at himself in the water and understood that the disguise was perfect because it was not entirely false. The 20 years had done their own work on him before Athena finished it, and what she had produced was the man the wandering had been making all along, simply accelerated and made visible. He walked up from the harbor to the hills above the city where Eumaeus kept the swine, because Eumaeus was where Athena had told him to go first, and because Odysseus, who who had been calculating entrances since Troy, understood that walking into his own hall without intelligence about its current state was the kind of error that ended things rather than restored them. He needed to know the layout of the occupation from the inside. He needed allies already in position. He needed his son. Eumaeus's hut was well built for what it was, a swineherd's working shelter, stone-walled, thorn-fenced, practical, and solid in the way of structures made by someone who intended to be in the same place for a long time. Eumaeus himself was sitting outside in the morning cutting leather for sandals when the beggar came up the path, and the dogs came at the stranger in the way of farm dogs that have not been told to expect visitors. Eumaeus shouted them off and brought the old man inside and gave him the seat he himself had been sitting in, the good seat, cushioned, the host's seat, because whatever Eumaeus was uncertain about in the general state of the world, the laws of hospitality were not among them. He had served in Odysseus's household since he was a child, which meant he had never served anyone else in any real sense. His entire adult life had been organized around the rhythms and requirements of a specific estate on a specific island, and the man who owned that estate had been gone for 20 years without reliable news of whether he was alive or dead. Eumaeus did not think he was dead. He would not quite say that Odysseus was alive either, because 20 years of disappointed hopes had worn down his willingness to say things he was not certain of. What he said instead was that he missed him. He said it to a stranger he had never seen before, over the food he shared without hesitation, because the grief was always close to the surface, and a stranger who would listen was a rare enough thing to make the conversation worth having. He spoke about Odysseus at length, about what the household had been before the suitors came, about the quality of Odysseus's governance of his small kingdom, about the specific texture of his absence as it had been felt from this hill above the harbor over 2 decades. He spoke about Telemachus, who had grown up without a father, and showed it in the ways a person shows a specific absence even when they have otherwise developed well. He spoke about Penelope, whose situation he described with the restrained indignation of someone who understood the injustice of it completely and had spent years being unable to do anything about it. Odysseus listened to all of this and asked careful questions and gave nothing away, and twice in the conversation felt the particular difficulty of a man hearing himself mourned by someone who does not know he is present. He told Eumaeus that Odysseus was alive and coming home, and he said it with enough specificity, details of his own wandering rendered as things a traveler might have heard, cities and coastlines that verified themselves by their accuracy, that Eumaeus had to work at his skepticism. He wanted to believe it. 20 years of wanting to believe it and being wrong had made him careful, and he told the beggar gently that wanderers sometimes said what they thought a host wanted to hear, and that he had been told Odysseus was coming home before, and that the telling had not made it true. He did not dismiss the man. He gave him more food and a cloak for the night, and treated him with the full courtesy of someone who has decided that the laws of hospitality do not depend on whether the guest's stories are accurate. Telemachus arrived the next morning. He came from the harbor on foot, having landed in the dark to avoid the suitors' ambush that was still positioned in the straits, and he came directly to Eumaeus's hut because Athena had told him to, and because Telemachus had learned over the past months that Athena's instructions tended to be worth following. He ducked through the low door, and Eumaeus rose immediately with the unself-conscious joy of a man seeing someone he loves, the same involuntary warmth a father shows for a son, Homer says, which is the detail that tells you everything about what 20 years of proximity to a fatherless boy had produced in the old swineherd. He gave Telemachus his seat. Telemachus made him take it back. The small negotiation of the seats, the affectionate insistence on both sides, took a moment that Odysseus watched from his place by the wall, with the attention of a man cataloging a kind of love he had not been present for when it formed. Telemachus looked at the beggar and asked Eumaeus where he had come from, and Eumaeus gave the account, and Telemachus received it with the careful courtesy of his father's son, told the beggar he was welcome, but that he could not protect him in the hall, because he could barely protect himself there, and that he was sorry for it. The honesty of the apology, its lack of pretension about his own power, was the thing Odysseus registered. The infant he had left was a man who understood his situation clearly and had decided to act anyway, and was honest about what he could and could not do. Eumaeus was sent to the hall to tell Penelope that her son had returned safely from Sparta. The moment he was out of sight, Athena appeared at the hut's entrance, visible to Odysseus alone, a tall woman with golden wand standing at the threshold, and nodded. Odysseus went outside, and Athena reversed what she had done on the shore. The age left his face, the stoop left his shoulders, the color came back to his hair, and he walked back into the hut looking like himself, not the young man who had sailed for Troy, but the man he actually was, weathered and solid and uniquely present. Telemachus stared at him, and then looked away, and then looked back, working through the possibilities in rapid sequence, and arrived at the one that seemed least possible and most necessary. He said, "You are not the same man who was sitting there. Are you a god?" Odysseus told him he was not a god. He said, "I am your father." He said it plainly, without performance, the way a man says something he has been waiting to say for 20 years, and finds that the waiting has burned away everything except the fact itself. Telemachus said it was impossible, that this was a trick, that no mortal could change their appearance like that he did not want to be deceived into grief by a false hope. Odysseus told him again. He said, "No other Odysseus is coming home. I am the one. I have been away a long time and I have come back, and that is all of it." Telemachus crossed the floor, and they held each other and wept, both of them together, with the specific quality of weeping that is also a form of relief, the body releasing what it has been holding under pressure for a very long time. Homer compares the sound to the sound of sea eagles whose young have been taken by farmers, crying over an empty nest, a comparison that sits with the grief rather than softening it, because the grief was real and had been real for 20 years and did not require softening. They separated and sat down, and Odysseus asked what he needed to know. How many suitors? How many loyal men? What the hall looked like, where the weapons were stored, who among the servants could be trusted and who could not. Telemachus gave him the count and the names and the layout with the precision of someone who had been living inside the problem for years and had thought about nothing more carefully. The suitors numbered over 100. The loyal men in the hall were few. Eumaeus was reliable, and Phaeacians the cowherd. but beyond them the arithmetic was very poor. Odysseus told him not to worry about the arithmetic. He went down to the hall that afternoon as the beggar, transformed again by Athena, and entered Odysseus's house through the gate of Odysseus's courtyard, leaning on a staff. An old dog lay in the dung heap beside the gate. Argus, who had been a young hound when Odysseus left, trained by Odysseus's own hand, renowned on the island for his speed and his nose. He was 17 now, and full of tics, and too old and too weak to lift his head properly, and he had been lying in the dung heap for years because no one in the occupied house remembered to care for him. He lifted his head when the beggar came through the gate. His ears moved. His tail moved once, the last effort of a body that had been waiting for exactly this for a very long time. Odysseus saw him and looked away immediately, controlling his face, because he was in the courtyard in full view of Eumaeus and could not afford what he was feeling. He walked past and into the hall, and Argos put his head back down and died, because the thing he had been waiting for had arrived, and the waiting was over. In the hall, the suitors were finishing their afternoon feasting. Odysseus moved through them with his sack, asking each man for scraps in the custom of beggars who work a hall, and most of them gave something, some out of habit, and some out of the mild curiosity a stranger generates, and one of them, Antinous, whose quality of character the hall had organized itself around, threw a footstool at him. The footstool caught Odysseus on the shoulder, and he stood still with it and absorbed the blow with the stillness of a man who has decided in advance exactly how much he can afford to react to, and said nothing except a quiet prayer to the gods that if there were gods who cared for beggars and for the laws of hospitality, Antinous might find the wedding he was planning somewhat delayed. The suitors' established beggar Eris took offense at the competition. He was large and loud and accustomed to his monopoly on the hall's charity, and he challenged the stranger to a fight before the suitors could finish enjoying the idea. Antinous arranged it immediately with the enthusiasm of someone who has found an entertainment. The two beggars would box, and the winner would have exclusive rights to the hall. The suitors formed a ring. Odysseus considered briefly how hard to hit the man. He could see that Eris was large but soft, the bulk of good eating without the muscle of work, and that a single blow landed correctly would end the contest immediately and also potentially kill someone, which would complicate the afternoon. He pulled his rags up and showed his thighs and shoulders for a moment, the lean, hard muscle of a man who had been rowing and swimming and building for 20 years, and Eris went pale and tried to withdraw, and Antinous would not let him. The fight lasted the length of a single exchange. Eris swung first and missed, and Odysseus hit him once below the ear with the restrained force of a man who was paying careful attention to not using the force he actually had, and Eris went down and stayed down. That evening, Penelope came to the hall. She came rarely and always with purpose, and her purpose tonight was partly to speak to the suitors in a way that extracted gifts from them. Athena had put this in her mind as a stratagem, a way of depleting them before the end, and partly because she had heard there was a stranger in the hall who claimed to have news of Odysseus. She sat in the hall by the fire with her women around her, and spoke to the suitors with a kind of warm performance of availability that she had learned to deploy as a tool, and the suitors gave gifts, jewelry, fine cloth, with the readiness of men who believed the gift was an investment. Then she asked for the stranger. He came and sat before her, and she asked him who he was, and he declined to say directly, "Not yet," because the evening was not the right moment for what the saying would require. Instead, he told her what she needed, that her husband was alive, that he had heard it from men who had spoken to him, that Odysseus was on his way home and would be there before the month turned. She said it with enough detail and enough apparent confidence that she wanted to believe him and knew that the wanting was the danger, because she had been given hope before, and the hope had not been good for her. She tested him. She asked him to describe what Odysseus had looked like when he passed through, and he described Odysseus, the cloak, the brooch, the particular shade of his skin, the way he stood, with the accuracy of a man describing himself, which is the most accurate possible description. And Penelope wept. She wept for a long time, and then composed herself and said that whatever happened, she would honor the stranger's kindness and give him clothing and a place to sleep and have her women tend to him. She offered to have a young woman wash his feet. He asked instead for an old woman, if there was one, someone who had suffered as much as he had, who was worn enough to understand what worn looked like. Penelope sent Euryclea. The old nurse had raised Odysseus from infancy. She had known him longer than anyone alive and had been faithful to his memory with the ferocious fidelity of someone whose identity had been formed in service to a specific person and had never needed to form around anything else. She brought the water and knelt before the beggar and took his leg and began to wash his feet, and her hands found the scar above the knee before her eyes did, the long, thick ridge of scar tissue from the boar's tusk on Parnassus, the hunt on his grandfather Autolycus's mountain that had happened when Odysseus was a young man barely into his strength, which had left this specific scar in this specific place on this specific leg that Euryclea had washed hundreds of times before he sailed for Troy. Her hands stopped. Her grip tightened on his leg. She looked up at his face, and he was already looking at her, and his hand came down over her mouth before the sound she was forming could reach the room. He held her gaze and held her mouth and waited for the feeling to pass through her and settle into something she could contain, and when her eyes had changed from the shock of recognition to the steady brightness of someone who has received the best possible news and is being asked to keep it, he removed his hand. He exhaled very slowly. He told her quietly, with the authority of a man who was not making a request, that she was to tell no one, not Penelope, not anyone, not yet, not until the time he named, which was not yet. She told him she would keep it as solid as stone or iron, and she meant it, and she went back to washing his feet with the steady hands of a woman who had decided what she was going to do and was doing it. Penelope had not seen any of this. Her head had turned away at the critical moment. Athena had drawn her attention elsewhere, as Athena managed these things, with a small redirection that required no intervention visible to anyone in the room. She turned back, and the washing was finished, and the beggar was drawing his rags back over his leg, and the moment had passed without her knowledge. She spoke to him again before he slept about a dream she had had, 20 geese in her courtyard eating grain, a great eagle swooping down and killing all of them, and she weeping over the dead geese, and then the eagle perching on the roof beam and speaking to her in a human voice, telling her the geese were the suitors and the eagle was Odysseus. She said she did not know what to make of it. He told her the dream had its own interpretation inside it. The eagle had explained itself, and that she should believe what the eagle had said. She said she wished it were so. She said she had decided to announce the contest of the bow tomorrow, and that she would marry whoever won it, because she could not hold the situation much longer, and the bow at least would produce a clear answer. He told her it was a good decision. He said Odysseus would be home before any man among the suitors had strung that bow. She looked at him for a long moment in the firelight, this old ragged stranger who spoke about her husband with the calm certainty of someone who knew things he had no reason to know, and she thanked him and went upstairs to sleep, and Athena brought sleep to her quickly, a heavy and restoring sleep, because tomorrow was going to require everything she had. The hall emptied, and the fire burned low, and Odysseus lay on a cowhide before the door, unable to sleep, turning over the plan in the way a man turns over something he has made, to find the places that might give way under pressure. The maidservants came through on their way to the suitors' quarters, the disloyal ones, the ones who had made their accommodation with the occupation, and he let them pass and lay there in the dark of his own hall with the plan and the anger and the patience he had been carrying for 20 years, and the patience was enough barely to hold the anger in its place for one more night. Outside, the island slept. Inside, the bow was in the storeroom, and the axes were in the storage where Telemachus would find them in the morning, and everything that was about to happen was already in position, waiting only for the morning to arrive and the feast day to begin. Chapter 14. The Bed That Would Not Move. The hall was silent in the way that spaces are silent after something irrevocable has happened in them. Telemachus opened the windows, and the morning light came in and showed what the morning light showed, and he dealt with what had to be dealt with in the practical way of a young man who had decided some time ago that he was going to be adequate to whatever his father's return required of him. The disloyal maidservants, the 12 who had been sleeping with the suitors through the years of the occupation, who had known what was planned and had said nothing and in some cases had helped, were brought out to clean the hall first, to carry out the bodies and scrape the floor and wash the tables, and set the hall back into the condition a hall should be in. They did this work. Then Telemachus had them taken to the space between the wall and the outbuilding and hanged there, all 12, one after another, because the laws of his world were clear about what happened to servants who betrayed a household, and Telemachus was his father's son in the matter of seeing a necessary thing through to its completion. The Gothard Melanthius, who had brought arms to the suitors during the fight, was dealt with more severely and in terms the chronicle touches once and moves past, because Homer's poem does not linger here, and neither does this one. Odysseus called for sulfur and fire. The fumigation of a space that had held violent death was a ritual necessity in the world the poem inhabits. The sulfur burned through the hall, and the smoke moved into every corner, and the smell of it was the smell of purification, the ancient Greek equivalent of drawing a line between what a room had been and what it was now going to be. The hall was his again. The walls that had held 100 men feasting on his livelihood for 3 years held only his own people now, moving through the ordinary tasks of restoration. and Euryclea was already at the top of the stairs before the fumigation was finished. She went to Penelope's room with the particular speed of a very old woman who has somewhere important to be and is not going to let her age prevent her from getting there at the right moment. Penelope was asleep. Athena had kept her sleeping through the night and through the noise below, the deep restoring sleep of someone who was going to need everything she had when she woke. Euryclea shook her by the shoulder and told her. She told her directly, without preparation, the way people deliver the best possible news when they have been holding it as long as they can bear to hold it. Odysseus was home. Odysseus had killed the suitors. Odysseus was in the hall. Penelope came awake fully and immediately, the way a person comes awake when the news is large enough to bypass the usual gradual return to consciousness, and her first response was not joy. It was disbelief expressed with the precision of a woman who had been given hope before and understood exactly what false hope cost. She told Euryclea that the gods could make a good man mad, and that perhaps this was what had happened to the old nurse, and that she should not say things like this as a joke. Euryclea told her it was not a joke, and described the scar on the leg, the scar she had found while washing his feet, the scar she had recognized with her hands in the dark before she had recognized it with anything else. Penelope sat with this. She sat with it for a long moment, and then got up and went downstairs, and her heart was doing several things at once that she was not yet ready to name. She came down into the hall and found him sitting by a pillar in the firelight, looking at the floor, and she sat down across the hearth from him and did not move toward him and did not speak immediately. This is one of the strangest and most carefully rendered moments in the poem, the long silence of two people in the same room for the first time in 20 years, neither of them moving, neither of them yet saying the thing the moment seemed to call for. Telemachus was there, and he was frustrated by it, the impatience of a young man watching his parents fail to do what the situation obviously required. And he said so, told his mother that her heart was always harder than stone, that she sat apart from his father after 20 years as though he were a stranger. Penelope told him, without heat, that she and Odysseus had ways of knowing each other, private things between them, and that she would test what was in front of her before she called it her husband. She turned to Euryclea and told her, loudly enough for the man by the pillar to hear, to take the bedstead from the master's bedchamber and set it up outside the room with bedding on it for the guest. Odysseus moved. The stillness that had held him through the hall's long silence broke, and what came out was not anger exactly, but something more fundamental. The furious certainty of a man who knows something is being challenged that cannot be challenged by anyone who does not already know the answer. He said, "Who has moved my bed?" He said it as a question, but it was not a question. He described the bed, how he had built it himself, how he had found the great olive tree growing up through the courtyard floor when he was building the chamber, how he had shaped its trunk into the bedpost and built the frame around the living wood, how he had inlaid the frame with gold and silver and ivory and stretched the oxhide thongs across it, how the tree was rooted in the earth beneath the floor, and the room had been built around it, and the bed was part of the room, and the room was part of the house, and the house was part of the island, and nothing short of a god with a sword could cut the tree and move the bed, and if it had been moved he wanted to know who had done it. He said all of this with the heat of someone defending something they made with their own hands and their own knowledge. And when he stopped talking, the heat in the room had shifted entirely. Penelope's knees went weak. Homer says this plainly. Her knees gave way beneath her, her heart went soft, and she crossed the floor and put her arms around his neck and wept. She wept because the test had worked exactly as she had designed it to work, because there was only one man alive who could have answered in exactly that way, because the secret of the bed was the one secret that could not be guessed or researched or told by any informant, because it lived only in the memory of the man who had built it and the woman who had slept in it, and no one else in the world. She had carried the test for 20 years in the same way she had carried everything else, quietly, privately, with the patience of someone who understood that the difference between Odysseus and a man pretending to be Odysseus was a single specific piece of knowledge, and that the knowledge would announce itself in the right moment without her having to go looking for it. She told him not to be angry with her. She told him she had been afraid because there were men who came to deceive a person with false stories, and that she had kept herself from him as much as she had kept herself from anyone, because the cost of a mistake in either direction was too large to risk. She said she thought he would understand this, because he was Odysseus, and Odysseus understood the logic of careful defense better than anyone alive. He wept too. He held her, and they wept together, and Homer reaches for a comparison to hold the moment, two survivors clinging to land after a shipwreck, the solid ground under them after the sea has done everything it could do to prevent them from reaching it. The comparison is the poem speaking about itself, in a way naming what the whole long narrative has been. The sea doing everything it could, and two people on the land at the end of it, holding on. They talked through the night. He told her everything, the wanderings in full, the Cyclops and Circe, and the Underworld, and Calypso and Charybdis, the whole account that he had given the Phaeacians, rendered now for the one audience it had always been meant for, the woman who had been the destination of the entire journey. She told whom about the web and the suitors and Telemachus and the years, and he listened with the attention of a man receiving something he cannot give back. All the time he was not there, given to him now in her account of it, which was the only form it could take. Toward dawn, Athena held the night a little longer than it would otherwise have lasted, kept the dark in place past the hour of its natural ending, because the night was still needed and the goddess understood what the night was for. In the morning he dressed and armed and went to his father. Laertes was on his farm in the hills, the old man who had withdrawn from the town and from the hall and from everything the occupation had made of his son's household, living roughly among his servants, working the earth with his own hands in the plain clothes of a farmer, because the activity of his body was the only thing that had kept the grief from consuming him entirely. He was digging around a plant when Odysseus came up the hill path, and he did not recognize the man coming toward him, and Odysseus stood at the edge of the field and watched his father working and wept privately, quickly, before he composed himself and went forward. He told him obliquely at first, a stranger who had once known Odysseus, who had news. Laertes listened, and his face did what old faces do when they are being told something that pulls the grief back to the surface it had been held below, and Odysseus could not sustain the obliqueness. He told him directly, I am your son. I have come home. The suitors are dead." He showed him the scar on his leg and named the trees in the orchard that Lotus had given him as a child. This pear tree and that pear tree, these 10 apple trees, these 13 fig trees, these 50 vine rows, each one given with its name and its place in the order of a child's understanding of his father's land. Laertes held on to him, and his legs gave way, the way Penelope's legs had given way the night before, and they stood in the garden among the fruit trees in the morning light and held each other up. The suitors' families had gathered by then. Word travels fast on a small island, and the dead were many and from prominent families, and the fathers and brothers of the men who had been killed in the hall came out of the city armed and angry with the legitimate anger of people who had lost their sons and brothers, and who lived in a world where the blood feud was not a failing of civilization, but its operating principle. An eye for an eye was not metaphor in the Homeric world. It was law, and the man who had killed over 100 men in a single morning owed a debt by that law that could not easily be calculated or satisfied. Odysseus and Telemachus and Laertes and Eumaeus and Phaeacians and a handful of loyal men formed against them in the orchard above the farm, and it could have gone in the direction that blood feuds go, cascading, self-sustaining, each death generating the obligation for the next, except that Athena arrived. She came as Mentor, the old family friend, the form she had been wearing through most of her interventions in Ithaca, and she stood between the two groups and spoke. She spoke first to Odysseus, briefly telling him to stop, and something in the telling had the quality of a divine instruction that does not leave room for interpretation. He stopped. Then she turned to the suitors' families and spoke to them, and what she gave them was the combination of divine authority and plain argument that ended the feuding not by satisfying it, but by making its continuation impossible, the intervention of a goddess who had decided that this particular sequence of violence was done now, and whose decision carried the weight of Zeus behind it. The suitors' families sheathed their weapons. They sheathed them not entirely willingly, not without grief, but the oath that was sworn in that orchard above the farm held, and the blood feud that the laws of their world demanded was set aside by divine decree, and the killing was over. The island settled back into itself. The harbor reflected the usual light. The goats were on the hillside. The fishing boats were on the water. In the hall below the town, the floor had been cleaned and the windows opened, and the smell of sulfur was fading into the ordinary smells of a household returning to its own rhythms, bread and oil, and the salt air that moved through every structure on an island that close to the sea. In the bedchamber above the courtyard, the olive tree still grew from the floor where it had always grown, its trunk shaped into the post of a bed that had not moved and would not move, its roots going down through the stone into the dark earth below the house, drawing water from somewhere deep and reliable, and continuing upward through the timber of the bedpost into a living branch or two that Odysseus had left when he built around it, green still, putting out new growth each spring in the room where it had been growing since before the room existed. The sea ran beyond the harbor. It ran the way it had always run, indifferent now to the particular man who had crossed it and been held under it and found his way across it anyway. Poseidon's enmity had been satisfied by decree and distance. The water beyond the harbor mouth was just water, just the ordinary Ionian Sea on an ordinary morning, moving under the same wind that moved it every morning, carrying the usual light on its surface, the way water carries light, briefly, changeably, without holding any of it. The olive tree grew in the floor of the chamber. The sea ran on. The journey is complete. Rest well.